But at the point at where the audience gets a little bit, okay, this is all getting a bit philosophical, you then just drop. You just then just drop. You're dropping a 12-minute car chase.
Hi, I'm Chas Fisher.
And I'm Stu Willis.
And welcome to Draft Zero, a podcast where two Aussie filmmakers try to work out what makes great screenplays work. But today we are joined by a
Fourth
filmmaker.
Ah,
Would we call you a filmmaker?
No, wait, filmmaker. I thought you were saying our fourth returning guest, like he's been on the show 4 times.
Oh, no. Well, anyway, to bury the lead.
Filmmaker, writer, producer, developer,
Welcome back, Stephen.
biographer.
Thank you. It's great fun to be here as usual.
We are talking about sequence questions and how sequences are used to structure the overall films and the different types of sequences you can have within a film and how, in some ways, that relates to genre and type of movie. And really, I'm a poor person to be explaining to this because it's all, as usual, kind of Stephen's thinking about sequences.
But should we just, before we jump into what Stephen's theory is, for the homework doers, are going to be looking at Mike Leigh's Naked, possibly contrasting that with Manchester by the Sea, Fargo, The Bourne Identity, Children of Men, There Will Be Blood, Diving Bell and the Butterfly, and possibly others as they occur to us.
Arise.
Very good. All right, so Stephen, what does Stu mean when he says sequence questions?
There's a school of thought about, or there's an area of talking about scripts which is to do with dividing the story up into discrete sections that comes from a desire for people to basically make your thinking about the story more manageable. So rather than thinking about an hour and a half or 2 hours or whatever it might be, or an hour, if it's a TV drama, you say, what if we can break the story into more discrete sections and then work out how those individual sections work and then kind of see how those different sections link up together or not, as the case may be. And so the background to this comes from a kind of theorizing that in the early days of movies and silent pictures, the reel was whatever it was, 500 feet long or whatever it is. And so basically, when you made a 2-reeler film, you had to change the reel. And so you had to have a climax at the end of the first reel so that you then had something to go to. You had a cliffhanger. And so basically, your first reel was 8, 10, 11 minutes long, and then which had a cliffhanging ending, and then you started a new reel and the story picked up from there. And then when you had 5 reelers and 8 reelers, this notion that the sequence was as long essentially as the reel of film grew up. Now this is the theory that you read.
Do you think sequence has, like, isn't it like, I guess a story structure unit has some history that is not tied to film? Like, I'm reading a lot of fairy tales to my kids at the moment, and they are very clearly sequence based. Like at the moment, we've got one of these glorious older renditions, like unsanitized versions of Hansel and Gretel, and there's clearly the sequence where the parents are trying to get rid of the kids, and then there's the sequence with the gingerbread house in the woods, and there's the sequence of Hansel locked in the cage and trying to be fattened up. And then there's the sequence where they kill the witch and are trying to get home. And they clearly have distinct goals, objectives, questions, worlds.
I think the best way to think about sequences in terms of screenwriting, I mean for film and television, is thinking in terms of chapters is actually much better to think of in terms of like individual items of length. I mean, the screenwriting theory tends to concentrate on the idea that it needs to be between 8 and 13 minutes long. And I think you can get kind of caught up in that, and it's not very practically useful. If you think in terms of chapters, that there is a natural end to a section and then you go into a new section. And that chapter, if you read novels, a chapter can be 40 pages long, it can be 4 pages long. It's really just the natural section of the story. The question is, how do those sections work individually? What is the internal dynamic of those sections? And how does the section work in relation to the next section? That's what we mean when we're talking about sequences. And that's, within a screenplay, obviously it's difficult to have an 80-page sequence because in a 100-page script, that's one sequence is 80 pages. So they do tend to be short, but the average is around 12, but they can be as little as 4 and they can be as much as 25 or more. And it really depends on the nature of the story. It's not a prescriptive. I mean, it shouldn't be prescriptive. When you read books about it, it is prescriptive. This is my beef about it. The books about it. I mean, my interest in this was stimulated by reading books about it. But
it's a particular school of screenwriting, the eight sequence story.
But when I went and read, for example, I went and watched. I would encourage people listening to do this. When you read something in a book that says, "Oh, this is what it is," and I would say, "Okay, fine, go and test that out." I was told this about silent movies, and I'd been accepting this for like years, saying, "Okay, well, sequences are like they are because of the the length of the reels, etc." So then one day at home, I had like 4 days to spare, and online you can watch nearly any great silent movie. I mean, they're all up there now. So I went and I watched. I just made a list to myself of what I remembered as classic silent movies. So I watched D.W. Griffith, and I watched Metropolis, and I went through all these, and none of them that I watched, without exception, I watched about 8. Not one of them had sequences that were organized according to this kind of 10-minute rule. At all. So I began to think then, okay, maybe the films I've watched are the pure exceptions. I'd have to watch obviously a couple of hundred before I could be definitive. But if these are the best examples, the eternal classics of silent movies,
stood the test of time,
and they don't work according to this way, then maybe that theory doesn't hold water. And so I'm slightly skeptical. But this notion of dividing your story into chapters, I do think is very useful, and I do think it holds water. And when I look at work, you can kind of see, and I think it depends on what kind of story you're telling. I think in certain kinds of stories that are highly structured, you have a very organized structure and you have a very organized sequence structure. If you look at thrillers, particular tight thrillers, or you look at farce, for example, I think both really tight thriller writing and really good farce writing is entirely dependent on a very tight structural organization of the story. So you can see those sequences really clearly in certain films. If you watch Margin Call, for example, a financial thriller, it has an absolutely rigorous set of sequences, and it's not very difficult to see them. You watch the film once to enjoy it, then you watch the film again to analyze it, and the sequences come out, they're obvious. It's quite clear and very often marked by the visuals that you see. Very often you have this thriller set in a building, in an office in Wall Street, and then you have the little sequence of the buildings outside. And as soon as you cut to the buildings outside for like 20 seconds, that's the end of the sequence. And then you come back in the building and off we go again for sequence 2. So it's the grammar of it is completely clear.
And just to point out the editing thing, the idea that it comes from post-production, there's 2 observations I want to make, because I agree with you. One, which is reel length depends on the film that you're using, whether it's 35, 70, or 16. I can speak from experience. Back when you used to get IMAX on film, the reels were 7-minute long, right? Versus a 35mm print. It's a distribution thing. So saying that writers should be, it's like, well, we're an IMAX film, our sequences need to be 7 minutes long, but we're shooting on 16, so our reels need to be 25. The other thing is in terms of editing is often we lock reels because it's simply a practicality of we've got roughly this amount of storytelling to do, and sound department and music or visual effects are breathing down your neck, and you've got to start locking reels in terms of just moving the film to final cut. So it's like, we're going to lock reel 1 and let's work out where reel 1 is, and we can negotiate with that and the editor and the director and whoever else about where we're going to put the pin in that little section of the story, move on. So it's not being driven by the script, it's being driven by the practicalities of production, is my point in both circumstances.
17th century French drama is a 5-act structure. So when you watch plays written in France and performed in France in the 17th century, they're 5 acts long, and each act is about 22 minutes long. And the reason those acts are 22 minutes long is the biggest candle you could make before the candle fell over under its own weight was only able to burn for 22 minutes. And so, and these are candles illuminated the stage. And so again, it's technology. It's depending whatever technology you have. It's like the argument about reels is that, you can only have a sequence for that long because the reel only shoots that long. And
we don't have reels anymore.
We don't have reels anymore. But in French drama, the acts were literally 22 minutes long because that was how long the candles will burn for. So there is a relationship. So then you think, okay, your dramatist is having to work within this medium. So the question then is for the screenwriter, okay, we don't necessarily have those problems in terms of sequence editing, but if you're writing television drama, for example, for ad breaks, then you are structuring your story in relation to how long a candle is in some ways. So the sequences do come from this mixture of on the one hand, a theoretical notion of can you divide the story into sections that are good for the writer, and the practical idea of, well, stories are practically divided into sections for various reasons to do with practicality and technology.
And you can see it in locations as well, to an extent. I mean, we're looking at Children of Men, and that clearly has 3 acts, which has 3 different worlds. You have London, you have the country, and you have the refugee camp. There's a number of different sequences within those sections, but it's so clearly Clunk City, Clunk Country, Clunk Refugee Camp. Like, the film is divided into those 3 sections.
In some ways, yeah.
So we could talk about the nature of sequences and the theories about where they come from forever.
Ad nauseum.
For a long time. And we probably will after we stop recording. But the thing that I mean, my interest in sequences was triggered by this notion of, the old theory about silent movie reels and whatever. So I started to look up this idea of sequences, and I have been thinking about it for quite a long time and trying to take it a bit further and make it more practically useful. And really, the thing about sequences is that it seemed very much to be something to do with plotting. That the idea of a sequence is you have a question that is the question that fundamentally drives the plot of the sequence. So you have, say, for argument's sake, a 12-minute section of your story. And you say, okay, well, in order to organize this 12 minutes, what you need to do is have an overall question that drives the plot of that 12-minute sequence. So it's, will Jimmy discover that his partner has betrayed him, for example? And in that 12-minute section, the question is opened. So there's a section a little way in where the audience becomes aware that the fundamental question at stake here is this betrayal going to be discovered? And then it will be answered towards the end, and there'll be a consequence of the answer. So because he discovers the truth, he does this, and that, whatever he does, throws you into the next sequence of the story. So because the question is answered in a certain way, the answer has a consequence, and the consequence then, as it were, provides the dramatic ammunition for the moving forward into the next sequence. And therefore, you can have a series of sequences where you have a series of questions, and if you could write those questions down, you actually have a series of questions that articulate the movement of the plot. Knowing this, he does this, then because he knows that, he does this, because he knows that, and that is, as it were, is your plot divided into 8 sub-questions.
Well, looking at Bourne, which is a very tightly plotted film, you get what's in the bank account being the first kind of plot question that's raised. We're talking about the first Bourne film, The Bourne Identity. And then the next question is, will he escape because the police and the army are after him? Then, he gets to Paris, and there's kind of a little bit of lull for, I guess, expositionary purposes while he's poking around his apartment. But then another assassin bursts in, and there's, each time... And the next question is raised about that he needs to find something out, but that there are obstacles in the way. And
they're all in service of Anne saying almost the titular question. Who is Jason Bourne?
Yeah. So you take your overall question. Will Jason find out the truth about who he is?
And he finds out right near the end of the second act, right before the sequence that we're going to focus on. He actually finds out. It's not resolved at the end of the movie. It's actually resolved.
Well, it's more like, will Jason find out the truth about how he got to be in the sea floating at the beginning of the story? Will he find out how he got to where he was? And that's the overall question. And then you simply divide that, and it's just practically in terms of plotting sequence questions. You divide the overall question, into 10 component questions, or 8 or 6 component questions. And basically and it's useful for the writer because, okay, well, I want to, take any kind of story. Will they be together? Okay, that's my story. So it's a romance. So how do I make an interesting story about will they be together? Well, what I have to do is I have to divide that question into 8 or 10 sub-questions. So in order for them to be together, what do they have to do? Well, they have to meet, for example, at the beginning. So you take the opening of the story and you say, okay, how do I get them to meet? Which is going to take the first 2 sequences. And then I'll have a question. This is exactly how you structure Sleepless in Seattle. The first section is, who is the male character? What's going on in their lives? And so what is the question that drives them? You set that sequence up, you answer it, then you cut to the female character. Who is the female character? What's the question that drives that sequence? And then at the end of those 2 sections, where we've introduced the audience to the male and the female character, we have them meet. And then we have our story. So you basically divide the opening into two sequences that allows you to introduce the two characters, each of which, because there's no story overall yet, because they haven't actually met, we have to give them an interesting dramatic question which relates to their lives. Otherwise, there's no reason for the audience to keep watching in terms of plot. It's just character exposition. So we have to give the characters a plot reason. So something has to be going on. So whatever the sequence question is of the male character, it's just a question that allows the audience to engage with the plot while we unfold the character underneath. And then once we do that, we switch to the female character. So the sequences are very useful for allowing you to do a lot of like character exposition underneath the surface of the action. And that's why they're there. That's what they're there for. But then the question becomes, okay, is it only for plotting? And if you look at sequences and say, well, the reason you have sequences is that you take a plot, which is a big complicated thing when you look at it, overall, and you divide it into 10 discrete sections, and that makes your plot more manageable. And that's why this way of thinking of discrete sections is useful. That's the theory. And that's kind of where it stops at the moment. That's where, a lot of the books you'll get about it really talk about in detail about how you do that and how it works.
Goal, stakes, and urgency is one way people have put it together.
Absolutely.
Each sequence has a goal, a stakes, and urgency to it.
I mean, we've looked at these books before, and each one break those sequences up into different kind of sections. I mean, going to where I think you're going next is is it possible to have sequences driven by questions that are not plot related? But Michael Hay does have two of those little flowchart lines, one which is laid out for the plot questions and another which is laid out for the character questions. So
if you're a writer of any skill, irrespective of what your plot question is, you should always be unfolding as with the character underneath. But the question is the character always unfolded underneath? And what if you say, okay, I want to organize my plot sequences in such a way that each one predicts the next, and so therefore it's like a chain link, that each sequence links in like a chain link fence to the next one, or like a necklace, and drives the story along. What if I don't want to tell the story that fast, that hard, that driven? What if I'm interested in character more slightly than this notion of a driven story? And I think, and that's kind of what I was interested in, this idea of what if it's a different kind of story? And I think sequence structure that's very tightly plotted works for very tightly plotted kinds of stories, like thrillers, for example, like certain kinds of thrillers, like farces. But then you have different stories. And then so I started looking at other ways of thinking about sequences. And I think there are three kinds of sequences, fundamentally. I think there are plot sequences, which are sequences that are driven entirely by the plot question, where character can kind of perform underneath, but really the sequence is driven by the plot question. Then you have what I would call plot character sequences, plot stroke character sequences, which are sequences where you do have a plot question that's primary, that the main question, as it were, the fundamental issue that drives the story forward is a plot question. But the reason that question is there is really more for the unfolding of character. So it's not, if you like, a plot sequence is where you have a question for the sequence that drives the story forward with the main and almost entire purpose of moving the plot quickly and engaging the audience almost entirely on the question of what's going to happen now, what's going to happen now, what's going to happen now. Underneath that, you can gently unfold the question of who are these people, but you're not asking the audience to really be thinking about that too much. Then you have a plot stroke character sequence where you have a plot question, but really what that sequence is about unfolding character. So it's the question, who are these people really, is kind of answered by what are they trying to do? And as you understand what they're trying to do, the question you become to understand that's just as important is, well, who are they? And they normally struggle to answer that question, because they are concerned with other things apart from plot. And they're in stories where it's not simply, like, for example, questions like, why should I do this? What do I get out of doing this? These are, as it were, more philosophical ways of thinking about action that the characters will have. And so you have plot character questions, which are where, as it were, the exploration of character and the exploration of plot is more in the balance. Then you have a different kind of sequence altogether, which is unusual, much less frequent, but which is a character sequence where there really isn't a plot question. The question of what will happen next is not being asked or even explored by the character. The character is not fundamentally interested in achieving anything. So now again, in many theories about writing, this is a bad thing. A character must always have an objective. But there are certain kinds of characters who have no objectives. Like, for example, insane people, very young children.
Yeah.
They have no objectives. They live in the present. So if you're building a story around that kind of a character, then you couldn't have a plot question.
Well, I think there's also we did an episode which we called Plot Light, where they were clearly plot questions, but it was often the same plot question being asked over and over again. It's almost like, as you said, the whole movie was one sequence, and really it was just allowing that to take a really deep dive into the character. So we looked at Amour, where it's one long exploration of, one man's journey in caring for his dying wife. And we looked at Happy Go Lucky, where the characters have life goals, but not plot goals. They're not being driven towards something. They're just going about their daily life, going to work, dating, having drinks, going to dance lessons. So there are definitely like larger questions that are driving the characters, plot questions, but really the sequences within them are not. You seem to be asking the same question over and over again.
What's really interesting and profound, I think, about when you go down this track, is that I think when you think about how these different kinds of sequences work, and you think about the kinds of characters that you get in these different kinds of stories, I think there's a kind of deep connection between the philosophical presupposition of the filmmaker and the way the form of the story plays out. If you look at Amour, for example, you say, forget the kind of the nuts and bolts of how the story is organized. Say, okay, what it's really about is this kind of relationship between two people who love each other very much. And one of them is coming to the end of their life. And these two people have kind of, built their lives around each other. So once one character falls away, the notion of meaning for the character falls away. For the husband who remains, his life means something because of his love for this woman. If this woman dies and is gone, his life no longer has any meaning. If it doesn't have any meaning, there is no causality. Nothing matters. In the sense of what happens doesn't make any difference. If what happens makes any difference, plot can't function. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So therefore, you have a story. If you really want to dramatize a man who's come to understand his life to contain no meaning, then there can't be a plot in his life. Yeah. Because a plot in his life implies his life has meaning. And the whole point of that film is that as soon as his wife falls away, there is no meaning in his life. And so everything it's not meaningless, but there is no, as it were, coherent pattern to it. He can have meaning in moments. The moment, for example, when he sees the bird in the landing is full of meaning.
And that's plotted. That is, will he catch?
Within the moment of the scene, it's plotted. But you say, how does that relate to the scene that came before, or the scene that will come after? And the answer is, in terms of logical plot, none whatsoever.
I'd want to rewatch it. But I think what's interesting about Amour and all those films particularly is that there is, most of them I think have plot questions, but on a scene level, and their intensity is very low, either because the stakes are low, like him getting the bird out of the apartment's very low stakes. And that means, I guess, I'm quoting from a previous discussion, by lowering the intensity on the stakes, you raise the intensity in terms of the meaning or in terms of the character?
I think the thematic stakes are much higher, because what does that bird mean? That bird poetically signifies a soul that needs to be freed. It's kind of, what is he seeing? When we see him trying to free a bird in that apartment, knowing that his wife is dying or died, I don't remember exactly where it comes, that bird has a poetic, metaphorical meaning that is far stronger given the context of that story than it would be if you had that bird poetically resonates in a way. It has nothing to do with plot. It's to do with your understanding of what the themes are and of character, who he is and what he's thinking of.
Absolutely. I'm just saying that there is a plot question. Quite simply, we'll get the bird out, right? It is a very tiny little skeleton.
You always need that plot question. That's the point. Because you always need that drive forward. No matter how characterful or metaphorical your story, if you don't have the drive forward, then you have, you're not running through time, and film is always running through time.
So before we get to diving into these plot character questions, because I fear that we're diving into the deep end too quickly, I just kind of want to give two simple examples of really high intensity plot sequences. I mean, hopefully for most people, they're self-explanatory, but I was just thinking of two that I could pull out here. And one of them is the bank robbery centerpiece in Heat, which is, will they succeed in the bank robbery? There's almost the character development comes in.
And will Al Pacino catch them because you've built up.
Yeah, exactly, right? And it's an incredible action sequence, which is all plot questions and it's all about the tactics in the moment, but the character consequences that, and obviously it pushes the whole second film is about who's died and who tipped off the police and all that stuff. But within the moment, it's about the plot question, right? And hopefully people have seen Heat and we don't have to really talk about it in detail. The other one, which is one of your examples, weirdly, is in Frenzy when the murderer, is it the ring, falls into the bag of oats, potatoes?
No. Yeah,
explaining it poorly.
He strangles a woman, and as she dies, her hand goes on his lapel of his suit, and in his suit he has a kind of ornamental brooch, and her dying hand grasps it and pulls it out of his suit, and then he dumps the body in a bag of potatoes, and then he dumps the potatoes in a van, and a truck's driving them away, and as he gets back to his apartment, he suddenly notices his pin is missing, and he realizes that the pin he was in his suit is now in the hand of the corpse, and that if the police find the corpse, then that may theoretically lead them back to him as the murderer.
Yeah, and so then he has to go and find Lapel, and the plot question is it's a whole series of really interesting moments. It's an incredible set piece, but it's about will he recover the pin? And often you'll see that. I mean, there's so many examples now. Come to think of it, it's like Rogue One. At the end of the whole end sequence is will they get the Death Star plans? You know, often those kinds of movie. And I'm just using that to illustrate.
Saving Private Ryan is my favorite. You know, the Saving Private Ryan, when they get on the beginning of Act 1 of Saving Private Ryan is firstly, will they get out of the landing craft onto the beach, and then will they get off the beach before getting killed? That's it. And there is no character, or virtually no character development in that story. There's a little tiny bit of character painting, but it's simply, they're at any given moment in that for 25 minutes, their lives are in danger, and it's only about how will they not get killed. It's all about plot.
It's only when it slows down do we get that moment with Tom Hanks and shaking and the Tom Sizemore it's Tom Sizemore again, putting the dirt in the tins. And we get it's when that plot question is resolved, or we have those moments to explore the characters.
Flip side from the end from the different section of a movie is the last sequence in Fury Road, which is will they make it through?
Yes.
Like there's tons of mini sequences in there of action where, and that's constantly escalating and constantly changing, but there's one plot question. Are they going to make it back through Immortan and Joe's crew or not?
Yeah, and often that's why you get the elaborate plan. Heist movies are a perfect example, right? So I kind of just wanted to get that out of the way.
Yeah.
So you can kind of illustrate, this is the extreme of like
that's
plot questions.
That's your plot sequence.
High plot questions with like the high intensity of plot. So the plot questions have high stakes.
The word is really good because the word is intensity. If you think of like a really intense plot sequence like Ryan, okay, where literally any given moment, all the people we care about in this story can be killed. So it's life and death is absolutely on the edge. And the level of intensity of storytelling. If you think back to that sequence, just the way it's realized, the way it's directed, the enormous amount of stakes at any given moment is life and death. It's incredibly intense. So basically, the intensity is all in the service of action. It's all in the service of the plot. So there's an amazing intensity. Now, the question I would ask about any sequence is where does that intensity go if you take away the plot requirement for it to exist? Like if they no longer have their lives at risk at any moment, literally the next second you could die. So the sequence is really intense because everything is at stake all the time. As soon as they get off the beach, it's no longer at stake. So that suddenly there's where the intensity of the action dissipates. And what happens then? You suddenly unfold the characters. Because you can't have a vacuum in a story. If you use that much intensity of plotting, as soon as you turn that intensity down, you need intensity somewhere else. And so as soon as they get off the beach, suddenly who these people are becomes, it kind of flowers. Suddenly you see you suddenly see Tom Hanks's character. Suddenly you see the sergeant. Suddenly you see there's a guy who gets given a dagger. They say, hey, look, there's a Hitler Youth dagger. And he picks it up and he starts to shiver and he starts to break down and get kind of hysterical crying. So suddenly all that intensity of action is translated to intensity of character. So, and that's really, I think, important to understand is that the question you always have to ask in these sequences is where's the intensity? It's either intensity of plot or intensity of plot and character and balance or it's intensity of character, but it always has to be intense.
And I think we're going to get to, I think you're right in terms of it always has to be intense in terms of a way I would put it is it always has to be compelling. You don't want to be bored, right? But I think there are going to be moments which are filled in by the audience, that the writer and the filmmakers may not have posed either a plot or a character question. And the film that I keep thinking about is Drive, where it's almost like a joke, all those scenes which is just Ryan Gosling staring into space while there's synth pop music happening. But you've had the plot lead before those moments and you have the plot following those moments. There's just this space, and it's not like he's interacting with anyone. It's not like he's doing anything, but you're just sitting there in the moment. And obviously the music and the filmmaking is driving the audience to feel something, but the audience is the one that's posing the questions. Like, what is he thinking about? Oh, is he thinking about this?
Would you not say that those are simply intense moments of character?
Yes,
that the
but
audience
it's not
is simply intensely engaging with the notion of the character.
Absolutely, but I don't think the question has been raised by the writer. I think the audience is supplying those questions. Other examples that we'll get into, like Naked or Manchester by Sea, the writer is very much in control over the character questions that the audience is asking. Stephen nods thoughtfully. I'm not entirely sure I agree with you, Charles.
I really am not, because what I think I would say probably is going on in those moments in Drive, for example, is that the fundamental question about the nature of the character, that's when the audience is beginning to engage with the question of, okay, well, it's not so much what's happening, but so much as who is he, what does he feel, and what does he need to understand, and what do I need to understand?
And it's about how far he will go.
Yeah,
but it's not like, I don't want to jump into one of these other examples yet, but I'm not going to. But I reckon when we get to the more character question sequences.
So let's go back to those ideas of sequences. You have a plot sequence, which is driven by action. So it's an active question to do with the plot. Then you have the plot character sequence, which is there is still an active question to do with plot. But the reason you're asking that question is really more to do with how the writer can unfold the character. And then you have the sequence question, which is really a character question, where they're essentially in that sequence, we're talking in the character sequence, there is no plot to speak of. In the sense, there isn't a determined active direction. The character is kind of meandering through, as it were, their life and their experience, but they're not trying to do anything, and they don't have an objective, and there isn't really a plot in the story. And so those are the three kinds of sequence. So you can say, well, in certain kinds of story, like in a farce or in a tight thriller, you will tend to organize the story around plot sequences. And then you can think of something else, like a more characterful story, like, for example, a road movie, where you have a overall plotted objective to get somewhere. But the road movie is really about characters and who the people are on the journey. So you will mix plot sequences with plot/character sequences, which are about exploring character. And then you'll have particular kinds of films which are not fundamentally interested in very much in exploring plotted questions, driving questions, but might be more interested in the nature of people, for example, or the nature of things. And you will have these kind of character sequences, which are much less organized. I have to say, I think those kinds of character sequence stories are very much less common than maybe a lot of writers would like them to be, because I think basically you can't really get through much more than 15 minutes of story in a feature script without having some kind of plotted objective. I think the audience, there is this fundamental requirement of film narrative, which is
let's be clear,
we have to go somewhere.
Very specific about yeah, exactly. We're talking about film narrative because there is art film, there is experimental film, and in preparation, well, Stu and Leon and I, our sound recorders, God knows what he's doing over there on the couch. But we went out for drinks the other night, and we were talking about the Stargate sequence, which deliberately from 2001, which deliberately goes very, very long without any plot or character question, and we discussed whether that was a thematic question or whether, much in the same way I think we'll get into with Naked or There Will Be Blood or Diving Bell and the Butterfly, and certainly the way where we got to with Amour, is that the very purpose of that sequence is to kind of unhitch you from narrative thinking, that desire, and to make you sort of absorb in the moment. And so I think there are, like, those moments in Drive, like, let me be clear, they're moments that last at most 10, 15 seconds, they're not a sequence. They're not even a scene.
But if you think of sequences, what we're saying in sequences in a philosophical sense is that there are three ways to understand meaning. You can demonstrate meaning as a writer, locking the meaning onto the meaning of the action. You can demonstrate the meaning of the story, locking the audience onto the action, which through the manipulation of action reveals character. And then you can demonstrate meaning by an investigation of the nature of people, not with action. Okay, so these are all, as it were, quite iterative ways of saying. There's another way of thinking about meaning, which is that meaning is not in some sense literalized in that way, that meaning is a poetic, elusive, intuitive, non-rational a way of thinking. It's poetic. So someone like Tarkovsky, someone like Paranjarov is basically saying, by showing a series of shots with repeated images and the use of music, I can make you understand the nature of the reality of things, which doesn't require a necessity to understand action or understand character. There's a deeper and, as it were, poetic way of thinking about the world. And that's an entirely, particularly in, for example, art installations, the notion of narrative is very often not explored at all in those things. You get repetitions and you get, it's not that narrative is not, the idea that narrative leads you to meaning is kind of an argument that cinema makes and television makes. But you don't have to accept that argument. And so within a film like Drive, you can say, what happens if we then have, as it were, a conventionally organized story which takes the argument that narrative delivers meaning, and within that narrative delivers meaning structure, we then drop in 15 seconds of non-narrative meaning, which is poeticism. And and Tarkovsky does much more than that. It's 70% poeticism, 30% meaning, narrative meaning. And that's another tool altogether. But that's not what we're talking about here today. But they're absolutely there.
Should we talk about the plot character question?
I was thinking we should move on to the Bourne Identity as kind of the softest entry point, right? Because it's a film. It is a film. It's obviously almost like a genre definer. As there's so many action movies now that follow the Bourne model, and we talked about this early, which is the original. We're talking about the original 2002 with Matt Damon, not the Pierce Brosnan miniseries. Was it Pierce Brosnan that was in the miniseries?
I didn't even know there was.
Maybe
one.
there was a miniseries.
So it starts to come back, huh?
No, it doesn't start to come back. The knot's like everything else. I just found the rope and I did it. Same way I can read, I can write, I can add, subtract, I can make coffee, I can shuffle cards, I can set up a chessboard.
Yes, it will come back.
I mean, no, it's not coming back, goddammit, that's the point! I'm down here looking through all this shit for 2 weeks I'm down here. It's not working, I don't even know what to look for.
You need to rest. It will come back.
What if it doesn't come back? We get in there tomorrow, I don't even have a name.
It's similar to a road movie, which is interesting because they have to move around a lot. I'm not going to try and summarize the plot. What is interesting is it's got this beat in the middle of, or a sequence in the middle of the story when Bourne goes to the house.
2/3 in.
Yeah. 2/3 in. And the house is the ex-boyfriend
Of Marie.
Of Marie, right? But the film slows down. And this is a beat that we saw recently in Logan. We saw a similar kind of moment in Looper. And we were talking about potentially it was also in Skyfall, had a similar kind of, it's become a bit of a template.
It's interesting you list those examples because they're all at very different parts of the
film.
The movie. Like Logan is at the midpoint, pretty much. The Skyfall is the end sequence. You're talking about when he goes home.
Yeah.
And that homestead sequence where they
and the fact we even call it a
escape
homestead sequence, so it's obviously because in Westerns. Point is, I think it's an interesting example because it actually kind of belongs to a kind of larger generic. In the proper convention, or I don't want to say a trope because it belittles it. It's part of the rhythm of these things where they slow down, have a moment where we get to explore.
I mean, it's because, it's, again, the interesting thing about this particular section of the story we're talking about is that this is a story that's constructed on plot sequences. And then, so you ask the question, what happens if I take a genre that, generally speaking, the action film or the Bond movie, whatever that it comes from, is generally structured as a series of plot sequences. What happens if I take one of those sequences out, no longer make it a plot sequence, and then make it a plot character sequence? What happens then? What that means is you take a genre which is not really traditionally that concerned with the complexities of character. So, for example, the morality of action is not something that Bond asks himself. Well, certainly he didn't used to.
Yeah.
After this movie, the Bourne film, he did. And that's because this movie changed the way that Bond thought. But previously, Bond would kill people and not go, is that the right thing to do? Is it a good thing? Am I a good man? You know, what does this make me feel about myself? All those questions are character questions. If you have a series of plot sequences in a Bond movie, the character never gets to ask those questions because the plot is driving them forward. In this movie, Bourne is on the run. He's discovered a few things about himself, and then he gets to the house. Suddenly, you have a character who starts to ask fundamental questions about his nature. So you have an action character, an action movie character, who's beginning to ask things like, "Is what I'm doing a good thing?" A fatal question for a plot-driven character, because he's beginning to question the nature of plot, which is
Maybe I should not be part of this plot.
And so what the question for the writer is then what happens to the plot? Because if you have a character who traditionally drives the plot, going, I'm not sure that action is good, you know, in the sense that what if the things that I'm doing are bad? They suddenly hesitate at the notion of action. And so what happens in this sequence is you have a sequence which is I want the character to kind of unfold themselves. I want to start thinking about who they are. So this is a plot character sequence. And so in that sequence, the question that drives, as it were, the plot question that drives the sequence is no longer controlled by the protagonist. Bourne doesn't drive the sequence. The question is, will the CIA nail Jason? They've worked out, and so what the sequence shows is the CIA, in a number of small scenes, the CIA working out where he is, setting out to get an operative to go and find him, and that operative will kill him. And that's, so as well, the action is
Who's
now...
also Clive Owen.
It's Clive Owen. And that's, that action, that part of the story, the action of the sequence is in the control of the antagonists.
Those are the targets. Beg, borrow, hack, tap, bypass. I don't care what you do. I want to know everything you can tell me about what's going on at those locations.
There is very much a plot question, but the plot question is, will Clive Owen, the professor, get Bourne? It's not, will Bourne do whatever, because Bourne deliberately relinquishes agency.
And coming back to our point of view thing, what is interesting is it's playing on audience point of view. We've got more information than Bourne, so we feel tension for him, we feel threat for him, and that makes it compelling, even though Bourne, and then that then also gives space for Bourne to be inactive in this sequence, because we are feeling tension for him, and in his inaction, at least for the first.
And what that also means is that as it were, driven action, which is, will they get Bourne? Will they find and dispose of Bourne? That doesn't take up very much space in the sequence. If you look at the previous sections of the story, the sequence of the story, which are all rotating around Jason and questions to do with Jason, will Jason do that? Will Jason do this? Jason is driving everything, and we're with Jason, and the action is taking up all the time in the sequence. There's no time to spare doing other things. Whereas now that action is given over to the opposition, to the antagonists, and Jason is beginning to think about things. And so the scenes with Jason are you have scenes where, you know, he kind of lies about who he is, and then you have a sequence where his girlfriend Marie is talking to her ex-boyfriend, and he says, you know, so what does he do? And it's a conversation about, you know, what's your boyfriend like?
What's he do for a living?
He used to be in shipping.
Is he good for you? Are you happy?
You know me. I try too hard.
We suddenly go to a much more conventional kind of world where people have girlfriends and boyfriends, and your ex talks to you about your new boyfriend. And, you know, the notion of, you know, international spy thrillers and action film, it's a different world
To
now.
put it into context, because sorry, I do want to say this, because to put it into context, the sequence preceding that has ended with Jason learning that he was an assassin. He still can't remember his past life, but whatever sense of morality he has since his amnesia he is ashamed of himself. And also Marie, who can clearly believe this because she's seen what he's capable of physically, is also questioning, like, are you going to wake up one day and be an evil person? Like, are you a monster? They're both asking that question despite still being on the run. And so that overhanging character question is also creating a lot of tension.
Marie,
Get away.
Marie, stop, Marie,
Get
stop right
away.
there. Stop right
Oh, what are you gonna do? Kill me?
Marie.
Is that what's next?
Listen, stay calm. Stay calm. Whatever we do, we have to do it together. We have to be
We? The only thing we had in common was that neither one of us knew who you were. We're past that
Marie,
now.
the police will find us, and the people who took that picture in the embassy, the people who killed Wambosi, they're gonna come here and they are
The
gonna kill
people
us.
you work for.
Absolutely. And what you need in the story is you need to create the space in the organization of the material to allow these questions to come to the surface. So you have to give, as it were, the agency of the action to the opposition to allow Jason the space to start unfolding these questions about himself and allow Marie to have these questions. So in the first part of the story, what happens in that sequence is that, you know, meanwhile the CIA are tracking him down and working out what to do about him, but Jason is at home. He's, you know, having to pretend to be a decent, normal person. Maria's having to pretend that, you know, their boyfriend and girlfriend. The ex has got his kids and there are his children. It's a very important part of the sequence, these innocent children that are around, and then they all go to bed, and Jason has to take the bedding from the guy and pretend that they're kind of lovers, but they're not. He's going to sleep on the floor, and so all the kind of sexual dynamics, their relationship.
They were lovers the night before, and since then they're asking that question. So that's, you know, an interesting shift.
And you're talking about where the homestead sequence is in the context of this story. It works because Jason has to learn a part of the truth of who he is, which is he's an assassin. If this scene was earlier, if this homestead sequence was before that, it wouldn't have the charge because this is about him getting to live a life that is not his, right? We get to learn more about his character by him play acting, being a normal person.
The point about it being a plot character sequence is that, you know, you couldn't do this kind of character work if Jason had the responsibility of driving the plot of the story.
If he was still interested in finding out who he was or the next piece of information, he wouldn't hang around in...
So you slow the action down. And another thing that happens here is not much happens in terms of action until quite a long way into the sequence. And so the action, such as this, is inconsequential. They have dinner together. You know, they wash up. They get their bedding. They go and lie down. And then Jason wakes up in the middle of the night and he looks at the children, and Marie wakes up and he's not there, and she goes to find him. And Jason says, let's just give this up.
What are you doing here?
The kids, I was worried. I couldn't
Wake
sleep.
them up. What are we gonna do?
I don't want to know who I am anymore. I don't care. I don't want to know.
Come on, we'll talk
Everything
about
I found out, I want to forget.
It's okay.
I don't care who I am or what I did.
It's okay.
You have this money. We can hide. Could we do that? Is there any chance you could do that?
I don't know.
And so you have this section in the story, extraordinary section in an action movie, where the action hero says, what if we just didn't take any action? What if we just ran away from the plot? What if we, you know, all these people are trying to find me and do stuff. What if I just disappeared? And and basically Jason is saying, is my destiny bound up in what I do? Or maybe I need to take time out to work out who I really am. And this is, as it were, the debate between plot and character. They're dramatized in the surface of the story. It's quite remarkable in that way. Meanwhile, the story is, of course, ticking over. Jason may want to do that, but it doesn't make any difference because outside is an assassin. Next morning he wakes up, you know, the dog is missing. And as soon as the dog is missing and he realizes it, bang, we're back into causality. The dog is missing, ergo someone's out there, ergo someone trying to kill us, ergo I have to stop them, ergo. And he's suddenly dropped back into the world of plot. It doesn't matter whether he wants to be a different person because the children that he's worried about are now in danger. And so he has to act. And so he's driven back into the world of action. And the second half, but once he gets to the climax of the sequence where he finds Clive Owen and shoots him. Clive Owen is mortally wounded. Clive Owen, as he dies, and Jason's asking questions like, you know, who sent you? Why are you here? Which are all plot questions. What are you doing here? Who sent you? You know, what's Redstone? And Clive Owen is saying, do you still get headaches? You know, are you like me? Are you on your own, aren't you? We're all on our own.
Who else is out here? Who else? How many you got with you? I'm not gonna ask you again.
I work alone like you. We always work alone. Who you mean? Who are you, Rome? Paris? Treadstone. Both of us.
Treadstone?
Which one?
Paris. I live in Paris.
Do you get the headaches?
Yeah.
I get such bad headaches. You know, at night when you're driving a car. I don't know, maybe it's something to do with the headlights.
What is Treadstone?
Treadstone said pills. They said go to Paris.
Is Treadstone in Paris?
Look at this. Look at what they make you give.
And all that Clive Owen's replies are to do with character. They're all to do with who you are and the way the way this life changes your essential nature. They don't speak to plot. There's a little tiny bit of plot, but they all speak to character. And then the Clive Owen's dying words, the last words he says in that sequence are,
Look at what they make you give.
and it's a fantastic line. It's about, look at what being a man of action does to the nature of your character. That's really what the subtext of that thing.
It drives the next two films.
Yeah.
It's such an incredible, powerful question, and it absolutely, which is why the 4th and 5 are so weird, I think. They like...
Little taste moment. I love the Bourne Legacy, the one without Jason Bourne. Absolutely despised the 5th one. It was just a complete awful film.
That'll be interesting because I do wonder if it relates to these questions. He's run out of these questions to ask by the 5th one is they want to turn him into a James Bond, right? I think is that where it fails down. He's going to save the world because that's what he's destined to do, as opposed to the question, can he escape his past? And they find more and more ways to keep, no, you volunteered for this. You were actually a patriot. You wanted this because that's kind of where 2 and 3 go, and they're all character questions.
2 and 3, I mean, the first 3 Bourne movies are essentially driven by one question, which are, who am I really? That's the question that Bourne is exploring. Who am I really? And therefore, what should I do? And of course, action in that sense is slave to character. Until I know who I am, I can't know what the right thing to do is. Therefore, I can't do the right action. And the paradox for Jason is that he's thrown into a world of action where, people are constantly trying to do things to him. And in order to work out what is the right thing to do in the long term, he has to work out who he is. But how can I work out who I am when people are trying to kill me all the time? And I don't have any time and space to sort that out. And that's the kind of paradox of the character, which is why it takes him a while to get to that position of resolution.
And that astonishing scene, like for me, the second film, that it takes him getting through all the action, basically killing everyone who's trying to kill him, till it can stop the plot again. And then there's that scene where he's apologizing to the daughter of her parents who he killed.
Absolutely amazing.
And it's all
scene.
about character. There's no plot question at all. It's just about him wanting to be this new person, someone who's taking responsibility, someone who's apologizing, someone who's feeling guilt, someone who's not what his past.
I would want to know that my mother didn't kill my father. That she didn't kill herself.
What?
It's not what happened to your parents. I killed them. I killed them. That was my job. It was my first time. Your father was supposed to be alone. But then your mother came out of nowhere. And I had to change my plan. It changes things. That knowledge, doesn't it? When what you love gets taken from you, you want to know the truth. I'm sorry.
The actions I made, what he's saying in that scene is, the actions that I took are not a reflection of who I really am. And it's that's the point where the character is kind of beginning to work, to work out. And it's the Bourne movies are extraordinarily brilliant because they simply take this sort of genre, the action genre, and then they debate and turn inside out the question of the reliability and the value of action. They're amazingly
And I think they
put together.
work as well because on some level, I think we can all relate to that idea of how much am I my past actions? If I have sinned in the past, should I and am I to what point am I beholden to them? And
But
how
at the
much?
point where the audience gets a little bit, okay, well, this is getting a bit philosophical, you then just drop. You just then just drop in a plot sequence. You just have,
Drop an assassin in
you're
there.
dropping a 12-minute car chase, which is a pure plot sequence. And and the way these stories are structured, that's the point. You're balancing plot sequences and plot character sequences. The thing I would encourage people to think about is, take a pure action movie. It's all plot sequences. And then think about what would happen if I took a action movie that I love, a kind of silly action movie. What would I drop in as a plot character sequence? How would the story change if I suddenly made a character think about the nature of action?
I'm now imagining an Amour remake with Liam Neeson, where he's fighting. It's like Rio Bravo meets Amour. It's like he's fighting off bad guys while his wife's got Alzheimer's. I'm going to write that.
But if you go to, for example, Naked, if we moved on to Naked.
Yes, let's move on to Naked. So that's Born Identity. We'll move on to Naked. That's what I was going to suggest.
Can you tell me something, Jack? What? What's all that about? That the old Highland fling there. Do you know you're doing that? What? That, and for my next tick. That. Look, it just happened again. I'm not imagining it. Fuck off, eh? You do that in a sack with the old tick spit. Hey, Maggie! Must be a great fucking shag. You're taking a piss. You're fucking giving it away, fucking come on, cunt! Get your fucking head up, eh? What's it like, being you? Eh? Bit hectic. Fuck off, piss!
You have a different kind of story, which is it's an art house movie rather than a multiplex film, and the writer-director has much more kind of serious concerns in many ways. Not that necessarily concerned with entertaining an audience and take them on a ride. He has something to say, and it's a story about a boy who arrives, a young man who arrives at the beginning of the story, who is kind of on a trajectory, and that trajectory is kind of excluding him from society. So overall in Naked, we say it's the story of this guy, Johnny Boy, this character, who he arrives at the story on the run. He's on the run from something. It's never quite clear what exactly it's to do with. It's kind of pretty clear, but not explicit. And he arrives in London, and he is troubled, and then he goes on a kind of odyssey through London, at the end of which he's expelled from that city and is fundamentally alone. So it's kind of the journey that Johnny Boy goes. So he comes into the story desperate, and he goes out of the story kind of completely isolated. So it's a story in some way of a character. The reason it's interesting to think about Manchester by the Sea, it's a story of a character who's kind of part of society, who by the end of the story is really excluded from society. If you get Manchester by the Sea, it's a story of someone who has self-excluded himself from society, who by the end of the story has kind of become part, even though in a very hesitant way, become part of society. So they're kind of diametrically opposite to each other in terms of the way the arc of the story goes. And in Naked, you have this progression of Johnny Boy, where, and again, if you think about it, if you say, my life makes sense, then what you're saying is the actions that I take have meaning. And if you say my life has no sense, makes no sense, then what you're saying is the actions in my life are of no consequence. So in some way, plot at the beginning of a story like that is where the character kind of thinks that they are part of something, i.e. society, and a group of relationships, and they can make sense of themselves. Plot is important or has a value. And if they go through their journey and they begin to realize that actually no one cares for them, that society has no interest in them, that there is no way that they're going to fit into this world, and there is no place for them, by the end of that story, you only have character. There's no plot. It doesn't matter what Johnny does. Nobody cares. Society doesn't care. He has no friends. Nothing he does has any consequence. There's no action that he can take that will make his life better. He's excluded. So in some sense, what the story is, on a kind of philosophical level, is a demonstration of the lack of suitability of plotting. It's about a man who literally loses the plot. I mean, and you think about what the story is, he literally loses the plot. He loses the capacity to take any action that makes a difference to his life. So this is the writer's problem. Okay, I want to write a story about a man who loses the plot, a man who loses all meaning in his life. So what do I have to do? And if you look at the way that Naked is structured, it does break into chapters. Those chapters are not the 11-page classical blah, 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 one real silent movie theory. They have different lengths, depending on whatever length they are, but they have specific sequences, and those sequences are driven by specific questions, sometimes plot towards the beginning, in the middle plot character, and then the further down the story you go, they're character questions. And they're no longer to do with action. Will Johnny, you see, if you look at the two sequences at the beginning that we're going to look at, the sequence with Johnny where he's looking for Maggie, the Maggie sequence. It's a plot character sequence in the sense that we're using a plot question. Will Johnny help Maggie and Archie to reunite? That's the plot question. But what actually happens in that sequence? And the answer is no. They reunite by accident.
Yeah.
There's nothing he does.
But he is trying? Not really. But he's not sabotaging.
No, he's not sabotaging. He's trying. This is the point about the
important.
character.
He is trying.
Yeah.
He's
It's
trying,
significant.
as it were, to have meaning. He's the one that says, in the sequence, if you look at it, what happens is he's out on the streets in London is sleeping rough, and then he meets this guy, and the guy is very disturbed, and the guy is looking for a girl called Maggie.
Maggie! Maggie! You all right there, Chief? Have you lost somebody? Yeah. Are you looking for somebody? Fuck off.
And he doesn't make much sense, and he's obviously quite a disturbed person. And Johnny kind of gets involved with trying to help him find her, and eventually he goes, well, I'll tell you what to do. You go off looking for her, I'll stay here where I am, and if she comes here, I'll keep her here until you come back.
Listen, mate, what do you think of this? Why don't you have a little wander around and go look for the wee lassie and I'll wait here? And if she turns up, I'll keep her here till you get back.
Aye?
How does that grab you?
You're gonna be here, right?
Yeah.
Right. If she gets back, right, tell her to fucking wait here till I get back. If she wanders off, knock her out. You slap her gub for me, right?
Yeah, I'll tie her up.
Aye. You're gonna be here, right?
Yeah. Oh, listen, what's her name again?
Maggie.
Oh, yeah.
Be back in a minute, right?
And that sounds like a good plan. That's an active, complex piece of plotting. Okay, and the guy goes, great. And off the guy goes, and then sure enough, the girl turns up.
Oh, you're Maggie?
What?
Is your name Maggie?
How'd you ken that?
It's just a hunch. Are you looking for the petulant dwarf? Sprickens your dice?
Archie!
Yeah, that's the fella. I was told to wait here for you. Your Maggie is Archie. I'm nobody. He's gone off looking for you, love.
Oh, you've seen him?
Look, would you just come and sit over here now?
Aye, fuck off, you dirty cunt.
And then they sit around for a while. Then Johnny goes, let's go and get something to eat. Yeah. And he leaves the corner where he said, if you said to the other guy, if she comes, I'll stay here with her. And then he, as it were, disobeys the plan that he made and goes and finds something to eat with her, talks to her, and then they're walking back to where they were, presumably. And then Archie, by coincidence, walks across the same piece of waste ground, meets Maggie, they start fighting, both of them forget about him, and they disappear off into the background.
Where the fuck have you been?
Where the fuck have you been? I've been waiting on you! Fuck off!
And if you think about what's going on in that sequence, I mean, what is that sequence for in the story? I mean, what's it really for? In the story, what it's really for is to show, we have this guy, Johnny, who's on this journey. And this journey, is, as it were, is into meaninglessness. Mm-hmm. And that's where he's going to get to end the story. Nothing he's going to do towards the end of the story is really going to make any difference to his life. He isn't capable of taking an action that is going to change the way his life is. He's falling into a kind of despair. In the middle of the story, he's trying to do things, but the things he's taking action, he's trying to organize his plot, but things happen in spite of who he is rather than because of what he does. Yeah. These people meet by accident, and when they meet, they both look at him and start swearing at him.
We did an episode looking at use of coincidence or plot, but not driven by character intruding on film, and how you take away character agency and you make the audience feel a certain way about them. Here's a guy who is deliberately at the effect of life rather than affecting life.
What's important to understand is that you talk about a plot sequence, a clear classic plot sequence, which without character, which is it has a question which is raised a little way into the sequence, maybe a quarter of the way in. It's explored. It has a midpoint that turns the question in a classical way, so restates the question in a more interesting way, and then it answers the question, and then there are consequences. That's, as it were, how a classic plot sequence works. You take this character sequence, in the plot character sequence in Naked, and there's exactly the same point in the story. You get the question raised: will Archie bring them back together? The question is answered no.
Will Johnny bring Archie and
Maggie back together? The answer is no, and that comes at exactly the place you'd expect it to come in the organization sequence. The twist in the middle is that Maggie turns up, That's the restatement of the question. Will Johnny bring Archie and Maggie together now that he's found Maggie, but Archie is gone? And so it all works in a completely
that's almost
classical
like a
way.
That's almost like a Pixar moment,
yeah,
right? We've lost Dory, we've found Dory. And
The structure is absolutely classic. And it's, as you say, the beats in the organization of the question are the same beats you would find in the organization of an action movie made for $200 million. None of the beats are different. Now, you talk to the audience about this film, they would not recognize that. You say, do you know this film, that sequence is structured exactly like Pirates of the Caribbean, or exactly like whatever big budget movie you want to think about. The beats are there, but the reason it doesn't feel like that is because the action doesn't have much meaning. And the film is not saying, okay, everything that this film means is invested in the action of the story. What the film is saying is, really, these actions are inconsequential. Whether or not Archie is brought together with Maggie by Johnny doesn't really make any difference. The point is, what we're really interested in is Johnny wants to make a difference. He wants to bring them back together. He wants to be part of something. And in this sequence, we're going to dramatize how Johnny works quite hard to give his life meaning. And then when they come back together, the objective that he has been looking for, it's by accident. It's kind of ironic. And he recognizes the irony. And he stands there in the wasteland. And these two people are kind of swearing and kicking each other behind him. And they've forgotten he exists. And all the action that he has taken has brought him into a position where he understands that he's meaningless in the eyes of the people he's been trying to help. That's what it's.
And I think the Pirates Caribbean just sparked me in the head because it is a good contrast. There is a version of this scene, probably on Tortuga or whatever island, where Jack Sparrow agrees to stay with the maiden and this person goes off. You can see how that works. And he goes and rambles. He's like, I'm hungry, you come with me. And it plays for laughs. But the ending would be different because Jack is a different character, right? It wouldn't be pessimistic. It's either the magic Jack just somehow coincidences everything together, as happens in the Pirates movie, or something else. It would reflect his character differently and the world view of that film differently than the worldview of Naked.
But if you then look at Naked, what happens after that? So that sequence comes on, and basically you have this, as it were, story that's been driven by action to a degree up to that point, and then you get this kind of plot character sequence, which kind of shows that maybe action can't be trusted, maybe things don't make sense, maybe doing things for a reason, like I'm going to get these people back together. What happens is he gets them back together in some strange way, but they forget about him instantly. There's no consequence. And so the consequence that he gets is basically the lack of meaning or importance of him to them is underlined. That
That's
he
what I was
doesn't
going
mean
to say
anything.
that might make it feel different from Pirates of the Caribbean is that the sequence, as much as it's a plot-driven sequence, does not then lead to the next plot sequence. And that's what, road movies often have that feel as well, where, a plot sequence or even a plot character sequence ends and they're still on the road and they're still going in the same direction. The overall plot question of the film has not really changed. That's why they feel episodic.
That's what's really interesting about, if we jump for a moment to think about road movies as a form. If you think about and the relationship,
you really want to make a road movie, don't you?
But if you think about the relationship between form and structure, and I something I always get very excited by, about how does the structure of the writing and the organization of the story reflect the thematic concerns of the writer. If you think about a road movie, broadly speaking, thematically, what a road movie is about is that the journey is more important than the arrival. So in road movies, people start off with an objective, which is to go somewhere. And what it turns out is the journey to get there is more important than the arriving there. Okay, but at the beginning of the road movie, it's all about plot. You have to set up, these people have to be set up in such a way that they have an objective. And so so you plot it. But in the middle of the story, what's going to happen is these people who are on the way somewhere are slowly going to realize that it's not so much about where they're going as what they're doing right now and therefore who they are. So the beginning of a road movie is plotted. Where do we want to go and why? Yeah. And then once they're on the road, that plot kind of falls away. It's a more consideration of who are we and what will we learn about each other on this journey. And at the end, you get this kind of combination of, okay, we are arriving where we set out, but we have learned this about ourselves.
And I think where people often struggle in writing or enjoying road movies, and I think that's why there's a lot of bad ones, is that bit in the middle doesn't feel driven.
And
it starts to feel
and
lost.
why is that? And that's because the bit in the middle is because when you are in the middle of this understanding yourself, it becomes a character-driven story.
Yeah.
It's no longer, so basically, if you had to say, how would you organize in terms of sequences a road movie, it goes plot sequence, plot sequence, plot character, character, plot character, plot character, plot character. So if you did an 8-sequence stuff, or maybe you might even go plot character plot at the end, and you might have a kind of more plotted sequence at the end. So it's about driven action at the beginning, driven action at the very end, and as it were, character evolution through the middle. Once you are on the road and you're beginning to think about yourself, then you begin to ask the question, is it even important whether I get there? Which the characters are asking the question, does the plot that started this film actually matter anymore? That's what the character's doing. Maybe action, maybe going to Acapulco or wherever I'm going isn't the point. Maybe the point is being on the road. Motorcycle Diaries is a really good example of this. There's a lovely Spanish movie called Living is Easy with Eyes Closed, which is the true story of a teacher in the 60s in Franco Spain who taught English by using Beatles lyrics for his kids. And he copied the Beatles lyrics down off the radio. And he had a book with lyrics in, and he heard that John Lennon was making a film in Almeria. And so he decided to go to Almeria to find John Lennon, to ask him to look at his book to correct his lyrics. So he has a clear objective. Will I get to Almeria and find John Lennon? That's, as it were, the arced, plotted journey. On the journey, which is a classic road movie, he meets a number of people. And he begins to realize the problems these people have, and they get into his car, they're hitching, and he lets them in. And he begins to realize these problems these people have are much more important than the question of whether or not he gets John Lennon to, correct his lyrics. So the issue from the character becomes, how do I sort out these people's problems whilst at the same time getting to Almeria? So what started off as a plotted objective becomes a plot character objective. Then in the middle of the story, one of these people is in such crisis that the question then becomes, how do I sort this person out?
Yeah.
And if that means I will never go to Almeria, it's of no consequence.
Yeah.
This person's problems are so profound. So what then goes? So it goes from plot question, how do I get to Almeria, to plot character question, how do I get to Almeria whilst dealing with these people, to character question, how do I sort this person out? Who is this person really? How do I understand who they really are? And so, and again, and that's the structure. And what's wonderful about it is if you think about, okay, we go from plot to plot character to character. So what is the journey of the character in the story? It's the journey of a person who begins to realize it's not where you're going. It's how you behave to the people that you meet along the way that is really the key to everything. And so the structure of the plot sequences, which go to plot character sequences, which go to character sequences, mirrors the evolution of the character. The content, as it were, of the story determines the form. Those sequences work like that because that is the demonstration of the journey of the character. And that's, in some sense, when you think about it, it's obvious. What happens in a story depends on who the people in the story are. And what happens in the story, which is the plot, depends on the character. So if you say the character is a person who is beginning to learn that my external objectives about my life, how do I get what I want, are less important than how do I help other people get what they need, then what that means is action, what I want, becomes less important. So the plot of the story must become less important. And so in some sense, your sequences are connected to your characters, which are connected to your theme. And that's what I think, now you get to a really complex kind of understanding of the interplay of the way you structure your story with the evolution of the character and the themes you're playing with.
I want to put a pin in that idea. I think it's a very strong idea, but it feels like something we should talk about more towards the end, about how you can use that as a generative tool or a rewriting tool.
Oh, I was just going to draw the parallel with the film that we looked at also in our plot light, which is Chef, where it felt like a plotless movie when we analyzed it, that we both saw that the first act was an extremely traditional, highly plotted structure. It's just that the plot ended halfway through the film, and we were looking at what is sustaining the back half of this film when the character question is resolved. Like, will this guy learn to be a good father? He learns how to be a good father. And then it's like, what is sustaining the rest of this movie, which is what we were looking at.
Speaking of road movies, I actually want to come back to Naked because we've got the second sequence with the security guys to talk about. But what's interesting about Naked is it's kind of a road movie on foot, right?
Johnny Boy is kind of an example, the main character, is an example of the kind of person that in Britain at that time was essentially being thrown away. That the political calculation by the ruling class was that those people don't matter. And so what you see is as it were, the journey of someone like that to rejection. And that's why there's a kind of anger and brutality and vitality in that character, because that character comes out of anger and despair. And so there's an amazing intensity in him. And I think the question, again, we talked about intensity at the beginning, the thing about Johnny Boy in the two sequences that come, you have the Maggie sequence we talked about, and then you have the next sequence, which is Johnny Boy kind of meets a security guard in a building. And he's cold and he's sitting outside, and eventually the security guard says, "Come in," and they have a conversation. And the end of that conversation, which goes on for 20 minutes, and it really is just a conversation. And the question, where is the conversation going? What is it leading to? What as an active question could you put into this sequence and say, okay, what's going on here is this? None of these questions are answerable. It's not going anywhere. And you had Johnny with Maggie and Archie trying to find meaning and trying to do something that made a difference, and he fails utterly. And then the next sequence, you get this, what I would call a character sequence, where the character is just who he is, but he has no objective. All his objectives are short term. Can he get in from the cold?
Have you got nowhere to go then?
I've got an infinite number of fucking places to go. The problem is where you stay. You with me?
Indeed.
And as soon as he gets in from the cold, he wants to know, can I have a cigarette? Can I smoke here? And then
he's drawing a parallel to, will I get the bird out of the apartment?
It's all short term. And then when he goes to a different room, he says, well, can I smoke in here? Well, whenever he goes to a new room, he goes, can I smoke in here?
This is an observation, not a statement. It's almost like an act. It feels like an actor thing, having the objective of the scene, like just simply playing the tactic of the scene. Like, given that Mike Leigh draws on rehearsal as part of his writing rehearsal, it kind of doesn't surprise me.
But at the same time, the character what's happening is he's beginning to understand. And I think the scene is, I have to say, in my view, one of the great scenes of British cinema. There's a scene where he describes to this security guard his view of the nature of reality, which is that, everything is prophesied, and he has this mad, insane conspiracy theory.
I'm not talking about astrology, I'm talking about astronomy. They're going to line up in the fixed signs of Aquarius, Leo, Taurus and Scorpio, which just happen to correspond to the four beasts of the apocalypse as mentioned in the book of Daniel. Another fucking fact. Do you want me to go on? The end of the world is nigh, bride. The game is up.
And as he rants about this, you kind of realize this guy is completely detached from reality. That he has his theory about the way the world is completely mental. And then you for the first time in the film, you realize the kind of gap between this character and any way that he's going to be able to engage with society. And you see kind of yawning open the kind of chasm between this character and any possibility of salvation. And you begin to fear for him for the first time. And he, at that point, is giving up. He no longer cares. When he was with Maggie and Archie, he was kind of trying to make things okay. He was saying, look, if you go here, I'll stay here. You do this, I'll do this. He kind of had a plan, which if they stuck to it, would kind of probably work. But the trouble is he's working with people who don't care about his plans and they go off on their tangents.
Well, he also goes off and gets chicks.
He also does the same thing. But in the next scene, he no longer cares even when anyone's listening to him. He doesn't care if the person he is theoretically trying to convince of his theories actually is convinced at all. He begins to become this kind of lunatic where he's kind of ranting into the night,
Like US politics.
Yeah, and it's just kind of, he's just kind of lost. And at that point, the story becomes only about character. You begin to realize there's nothing he can do. Previously in the previous sequence, it was a plot character sequence. The notion of action being valuable, that there are things you can achieve by doing things, was still alive. And now we're in this sequence and you can begin to realize there's nothing this guy can do. There's no action. There's nothing the person he's with can do. It's not going to stop him talking. This is just people kind of ranting at each other. Many people turn off from this at the moment. When they watch that, the audiences don't like it. Loads of people kind of turn away from the film. That's because what you're presented with here is a kind of pure character sequence, and very few stories have them.
Would you call it a character-driven sequence?
Yeah,
or would you call it character?
You say, what drives the action here? Okay, what in the action of this sequence, what question could you articulate? And you'd say something like, will Johnny Boy come to understand that his peculiar way of understanding the way the universe is related makes no sense to anyone other than himself? And if he keeps talking like this, all that will happen is that he will alienate himself from everyone else he talks to. Now that's a clumsy, long-winded question. The way that you define character questions and character sequences, as apart from plot questions, are that the plot questions should be short and concise and comprehensible, and character questions should be long and meandering and incomprehensible.
And plot questions, I think part of what makes plot questions is that there is a clear, often visual answer for the audience. We all, Maggie and Archie meet, yes, and we, the audience, know that question has been resolved.
It's almost
because
like
we
there's
see
a
it.
physical
it's a
outcome.
physical outcome.
It's expressed.
Dramatized, for lack of a better word.
It's expressed as will X do Y. It's do. It's a question, will they do it? And that do, the thing they do must be clearly observable. So it's without question true in a plot question. In a character question, in a character sequence, you say there is no plot question. If you say, look at that sequence with Johnny Boy in the room with the security guard in the building, you say, what are they doing? The answer is they're just walking around to no purpose. There's no action, there's no question you can characterize over that 20-minute section of the story which actually articulates the organization of the story at that point. There is a character question. Will Johnny understand? And that's why it's a character question.
And it's inward focused.
It's an inward, it's not about what will happen, it's what will the character come to learn? Yeah. Or will indeed they learn at all?
And it's not, and it is a question, and I'm not saying all character questions would be like this, but it's one that the audience is coming to themselves in a way. It's not like another character is putting it to him in dialogue saying, you do understand that if you keep talking like this, blah, blah, blah will happen. You know, it's
not a Marvel film.
Yeah. As soon as you get to this level, you know, what happens is, you know, your audience falls away because an audience brought up on plot questions. These things are obvious. You know, will they save the world? Will they do this? Will they do that? Within a character question, in some sense, the audience has to articulate it to themselves. Yes. I understand what's going on here. If Johnny doesn't understand this, then he'll be in trouble. And that's kind of what the audience has to do, that work. And some audiences go, I don't come to the movies to do that. I want something else. And that's fine, you know? But the audiences that love it. But
it can work because I think, and this is throwaway and I haven't analysed it, but I was thinking about it as a reference point, weirdly, because we're talking about the relationship of plays to this, which is Moonlight, right? So Moonlight feels like it's got 3 distinct movements and they all feel like plot. The middle movement, definitely plot question, plot character, but even the third act when he goes to the diner, which is amazing, is plot character, but then the plot questions kind of resolved very early and it becomes complete character question, and it has that. People found it, I know some people found it unsatisfying because it is that kind of meandering self-actualization, but obviously Moonlight tapped a wide audience and there's a whole bunch of reasons I think that worked, but perhaps because it just had that little surface skeletal structure of plot, of the diner, cooking the food, I'm going to make you the best, you know, sandwich, all that stuff. Whereas ticking underneath, you don't quite have that in this naked sequence.
The thing that writers need to understand is that if you think about a story, broadly speaking, the easiest way to get an audience interested in a story is to say what happens next, which is to say the area of plot. So, you know, things happen, something happens, something else happens, and, you know, we throw the audience into the story and they want to know what happens next. The question of who are these people really? What do they really care about? What is their true nature? Is something that's much harder to unfold for an audience. So you'll normally start a story with plot, so you get them hooked into the story on the basis of what happens next. As the plot moves forward, you start to unfold the nature of the characters. At a certain point in the story, you can then go, well, hang on a minute, let's not worry so much about what's happening next. Let's worry about a bit more now about who these people are. If you look at Naked, even though it's a very unconventional art house movie, it works in the same way. Johnny Boy is thrown into the world, he's on the run, and it's kind of like, who is Johnny Boy? What is he doing? What is he running from? These are all plot questions. Who will help him? And then as he goes into London and he meets his friends and eventually alienates himself from his friends, he then goes on this odyssey through the middle of London, through the middle of the film, and gradually becomes less worried about what's going to happen to Johnny and more about who is he and how will he find a way of relating to the world. And then gradually you realize he isn't going to find a way of relating to the world. And you realize that there is no place in the world for him. And actually his way of understanding reality doesn't even make much sense to everyone else. He's becoming more and more isolated. And so you watch a person kind of thrown into a story And for plot reasons, and as it was, the more the story goes on, the less important plot is. And that's, as we said at the beginning, because he's losing the plot. Literally. There is no meaning in his life. There's no causality. What he does no longer has an effect. He's inconsequential. He doesn't understand anything. He doesn't listen to people. He doesn't take account of what they say. He doesn't care about other people's feelings. He's not, as it were, social in any way. And gradually, as all those boundaries that most of us have fall away for this character, he has no way of taking consequential action. So at the end, you have a character who kind of is doing meaningless things. And for the audience, you realize that there is no meaning to his action. It's all character. And actually, it's a very despairing kind of journey. So the point I want to make in terms of structure is, how does Naked work in terms of sequences? It's plot sequence at the beginning, then it moves into plot character sequences, which is where the character is doing things in order to try and understand. As the character loses the plot, it becomes character sequences, i.e. there is no relationship to action anymore in this character. And now, the point I really think is really important to understand is that in order to illustrate that character's journey, you can only do it using plot sequences, followed by plot character sequences, followed by character sequences. If you look at the Bourne story, normally these films, and it's a genre film, unlike Naked, which is an art house drama. When you have a genre film, if you're thinking in terms of organization of your story, you have to ask the question as a writer, normally, how do these genres work in terms of sequences? An action movie, we have a Bond movie, for example, prior to Bourne, is essentially driven by plot sequences. So you ask yourself the question as a writer, do I want to organize my sequences in that way? The way that genre like this always does? Or what if I want to change the genre? What if I want to provoke the genre? What if I want to, in some way try to move things forward? What if I take a story that is normally structured through plot sequences, and in the middle of the film, I drop in a plot character sequence? That's going to change everything, because these stories are normally structured in this way. So if you're writing genre, you have to ask yourself a question in terms of your sequence analysis. You say, okay, well, how does a film like this normally work? And you have to go and watch a lot of them, and you have to understand this is a plot sequence, this is a plot character sequence. Normally, this is where this will be. This is how they're generally shaped. And then you ask the question, do I want to obey that? Am I being slavishly faithful? Or what happens if I change? And the question of whether you change or not is the first question, not, what do I change it to? The question should become, do I want to change it? And what's the effect if I do? Now, the effect on Bourne, when they dropped in a plot character sequence into a story that normally has plot sequences, is that it became impossible to make Bond movies the same way after that moment. Because as soon as you make a shallow character complex, which is what happens when you take a plot sequence and turn it into a plot character sequence, is that the plotting becomes less important, the character becomes more complex. As soon as you make that as an action character complex, then your Bond character, your previous Bond, becomes idiotic. When you have Bourne being a character who is just as active as James, can have just as many car chases, just as many relationships with women, just as much excitement, but then also says, as he does in the middle of that film, what if I didn't do this anymore? What if I stopped? What if he ran away? Would it be possible to escape? Could I be happier? All of those questions. You can't make a Bond movie like you used to as soon as Jason Bourne asks those questions, because he makes everything that came before fatuous.
Have you seen The Kingsman?
And that was the point where Bond movies changed.
Kingsman is, but that's becomes thematic.
Yeah, I mean, have you seen The Kingsman? Kingsman. It's a Matthew Vaughn almost satire on Bond movies in the same way that he did Kick-Ass, which was a satire on superhero movies.
I think they work because the writer writes them as a satire and he directs them straight. That's my opinion, right?
But it is a superhero origin story, but it's what's wonderful about it.
Kick-Ass. Super Spy.
Super Spy origin story. But what is quite interesting threaded throughout it is classes is very classist. So it is very much going back to the old school Bond, where it is largely just plot sequences and very kind of glitzy and superficial and in a way fun. Another distinction is it's quite R-rated, so there's lots of blood and gore and sex and what have you. But I think the one thing that allows it to go back to that model where it is far more plot than character is the thematic stuff, where the kid who's the main character is someone who's from a he's almost out of Naked or from This Is England, or he's like a Shane Meadows character whose father died in a war mission. And so this secret society of spies look after him and raise him up. But then he has to learn, because it's a Bond spy, he has to learn how to be a gentleman as well as how to be a spy. He's like much better at all the spy stuff than being a gentleman. But what sustains it is not, those are all character kind of related questions, but it's
the characters are more complex, though, isn't it? And there's a complexity of character,
and there's a world, and it is kind of hero's journey, ordinary world sequences at the early when you see that he lives at the projects and he's getting bullied and he's a petty criminal, and how that then contrasts to the world of the James Bond upper class. But they are plot. I think they are plot character questions that those.
Some of them.
Yeah, but I think they ultimately are there to serve a reveal.
The interesting question in each case, if you think of the Bourne story, or if, for example, when you have a plot sequences, the action is very driven and very fast and very active. When you get to the middle and Jason starts saying, "Who am I really?" then what you have is, instead of having, as it were, fireworks on the surface of the story, you start to dive down into the depths of the character. You start to ask philosophical questions. How should I be? What kind of person should I be? How meaningful is the action that I take? And so in the question of where the energy of the story goes, the word we used before was intensity. The energy of the story starts going away from, as it were, the surface action into the complexity of character. And again, if you're going to have that complexity of character, you can't have too much complex surface action. Because if Jason was running around shooting people and punching people, he wouldn't be able to ask these questions. So you have to relax the driven plot in order to get the intensity of character. There's always a payoff here. And interestingly, Naked, when you look at how Johnny Boy's character, the most intense version of Johnny Boy is when he's in that sequence with his only character stuff. His vocabulary, the language, you have never seen dialogue like it. If for the most, this is baroque, extraordinary dialogue. This character is consumed with passion, meaningless passion. He cares deeply for something that is completely pointless. But the performance and the intensity of the dialogue and the attack of the character is incredible. And it has to be because there's no plot.
Yeah. So they've lifted.
If it wasn't intense,
yeah,
you'd have your story would just limp. The story would become limp.
Well, what about when we were trying to decide what films we should look at for this? It then prompted me to ask, well, what about films that start without those plotted sequences to ground the audience in the story? And the two that we came up with were Diving Bell and the Butterfly and There Will Be Blood, because both of those start.
No, I want to address them. I'm just going to finish the Kingsman discussion.
Okay.
Because I think this relates to what you're saying. Because I was thinking about the Bourne identity. The Kingsman, ultimately that moment where he confronts who he is, and I can't remember the name of the character, and the world, Eggsy, is ultimately he's asked to shoot this dog that he's raised, right? And he accidentally got the runt of the litter. And
it pains me to admit it, Eggsy, but I think that one day you might be as good a spy as any of them. Take it. Shoot the dog.
This weapon is live. Shoot the dog.
Give me the gun. At least the girl's got balls. Get out. I knew you couldn't make it. Go home.
But ultimately, they found a way to dramatize his, I don't know if I can do this, Jason Bourne 15-minute sequence to a very simple character choice of, can you kill this dog because your commander has asked you? And he can't, so he leaves. And that's it. And it's a plot question that reflects character, right? But it is not a pure character moment. And I just think that is an interesting example of the writers have found a moment to bring all that down in a way that the Bourne movies went for something that was more meandering rather than a specific moment.
It's an interesting question
choice.
about what is the difference for an audience in experiencing, if you like, a plot plotted sequence and experiencing a plot character sequence and experiencing a character only sequence. And I think the answer, for broadly speaking, is an audience that, as it were, follows a plot sequence is following the action. So basically you have to pay a lot of attention to what's going on screen. You're in it, and you have to, understand what's going moment by moment. When you're looking at a plot character sequence, like Bourne sequence we talked about, you begin to realize the character is beginning to ask questions about, whether they should be the person they are, and they're kind of beginning to become introspective. And at that point, there's a kind of connection between, in a very, not in a profound way, but in a gentle way, between the audience's notion of, okay, this character is asking questions like, who should I be and how should I live my life? And in some sense, that mirrors my own activity. I do this in my own life too. Like I ask these questions. So there's a kind of affinity of, if you like, mimetic affinity between the characters. When you have a story where there's no action, and the character simply, as it were, asking character questions, you're looking at, for example, Johnny Boy, and you're looking at him thinking, this person has no connect. When he's at his most intensely characterful, as we're in Naked, you're looking at him thinking, this person has no connection with the way that reality is. Which means that you are kind of saying to yourself, I understand I understand what this connection, and it's making you think a lot more about yourself. And as it were, what I'm broadly saying is that the more characterful you get, the more, as it were, it makes the audience introspective. It makes the audience ask questions about themselves rather than necessarily about what's going on the screen. Because in terms of plot, there's nothing to understand. There's nothing happening. Johnny Boy will rant for the next 10 minutes. And in terms of action of the story, nothing is going to happen.
Because I think going back to that Drive example, I think the audience question that you end up asking, if you hold on that beautiful Ryan Gosling look with that Cliff Martinez soundtrack in the background long enough, is what would I do if I was in his position?
Talking about Diving Bell and the Butterfly.
After murdering segues for 20 minutes.
Now we can try to maintain, we can prolong your life today.
Is this life?
Yeah.
Is this life?
We can prolong your life. There you are. Well, I won't put any punches here, my friend. The paralysis is complete. Okay? I've noticed you're not able to speak.
I can't speak. I can't speak.
So you have what's referred to as
what?
Locked-in syndrome. Yeah.
Locked-in syndrome.
Locked-in syndrome.
When if you look at the beginning of Diving Bell and the Butterfly, what happens at the beginning, which is again an unusual story because it begins with a character sequence, not a plot sequence. The beginning of Diving Bell and the Butterfly, we see this person waking up, and we don't know anything about them, and so like they don't, and it's an entirely subjective sequence. You put the audience, as it were, in the shoes of the character. And whatever the character is understanding for those 10 minutes...
We're quite literally seeing them from their eyes.
You're literally looking through their eyes. And so the character has no understanding of what's happening. And neither does the audience. Who is he? What's going on? Where am I? All the questions the character is asking, the audience is asking. There is no plot because...
we have to give at least a brief summary that this guy's got locked-in syndrome. And the opening sequence is him waking up in the hospital, and we can, because we are in his point of view entirely, we can hear him talking to these doctors and other health professionals who are talking to him, and it's only as that sequence unfolds that we realize that they can't hear him speaking, that we are entirely in his... It's almost like reading a book.
Yeah. It's deliberately structured so the audience has to kind of, it's brilliant. I mean, you could do a masterclass on exposition. If you want to say the most brilliant piece of expositionary writing I know, it's the first 10 minutes of Diving Bell and the Butterfly. There is an extraordinary amount of exposition in that 10, 15 minutes.
I wish we'd done it in our exposition.
But it's completely, the audience doesn't notice. But if you stop the film and say, tell me what you know about this guy, the audience could tell you an enormous amount about him, because they keep repeating, this is your name, this is where you come from, this is your family, this is what you used to do, this was your job, this is what happened to you, but the person isn't registering it. And because the character doesn't quite understand what's happening, all these characters are saying things to him, but he doesn't get it, and the audience doesn't quite get it because they're kind of, as it were, subjectively experiencing the moment like him. It's an entire character seek. The question, if you say, what's the plot question of the beginning of this film? Basically, you have a man who has had a stroke and is waking up slowly. So he's only gradually becoming conscious of the world around him and how it works and what the logic is. And he's in and out of consciousness. And the audience experiences all of that entirely subjectively. So if you say, what is the plot question? Will Jean-Dominique Bauby, which is the name of the character, will Jean-Dominique Bauby understand what is happening to him? Is kind of the only plot question. That question is answered immediately. He kind of does. So it's not in dispute. It's not
but
like...
I would say, here's where I kind of disagreed with you, to the extent that I don't think there is a plot question such that there isn't a question posed about that can be physically visualized or dramatized.
Observed like a scientific.
I want to do something. But I think there is very much an audience question. It's almost like a murder mystery. Yeah. It's like, let's figure out what the hell is going on right here that is very much driving interest in that sequence. Like, why are these people acting like they can't hear what he's saying?
From the writer's perspective, I agree. That's absolutely right. From the audience perspective, the audience is asking, and I put it in this order, who is this person and what has happened to him? I think is what the audience is asking. But the reason you organize your story and say, okay, well, in this situation, what I'm going to do is, rather than, for example, dramatize, like, you could start with Jean-Dominique getting into his car because he has a stroke in his car. You could say, what if we started with him getting into his car, going to pick his kid up, and then he's going along the road, and then he has a stroke, and then we see him picked up by the ambulance and whatever. Yeah. You could tell it straight like that.
And then the question would be, will Dominique
Bauby die before he gets to hospital or whatever? So you could start it that way. And the writer goes, no, I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to have a character question. So you say, what question drives, from the writer's point of view, drives the opening of that question? It's, will Jean-Dominique Bauby fully understand the implications of his condition? I think it's probably as a character question that drives that sequence. And from that, the audience will then go, okay, well, I have to understand who he is and what happened to him.
Can you tell me, from your perspective, why that's not a plot question, why that's only a character question?
Because it's understand. The question is, will Jean-Dominique Bauby understand, which is to do with an internal process for the character. It's a character question. Will the character, as it were, come to an understanding of their essential problem? It's not what will he do.
But interestingly, that him coming to the understanding is actually in a way, the inciting incident for the plot. Because as soon as he fully understands what has happened to him, then he's got the question of, what do I do with the rest of my life? I'm going to write a book with my eyelid.
But that's the end of Act 1.
Yeah, the writing a book. There is a sequence where he's like in despair and trying to learn how to communicate and all that kind of stuff.
And that's largely Act 2 from memory, right? So there's a plot in the middle, but that's pure character meeting character at the end.
What Stuart said is really important, because if you look at most stories...
I don't think anything Stuart says is really important, so
that's because you just don't want to read my notes on your scripts.
Most stories are essentially, the plot starts and sets a plot question, which is driven for the rest of which is explored for the rest of the story, and then at the end is answered, and that's the end of the story. And underneath that, you have a character question. So, for example, Dorothy, the example I always use, Dorothy is,
will she get home?
Dorothy, will she get home? And I'll be more precise about that. Will Dorothy find Auntie Em, which I think is the deeper question of Wizard of Oz. So she wants to get to Kansas to find Auntie Em, not to go to Kansas. She has no great affinity with Kansas, but she has a specific affinity to Auntie Em. So Dorothy, as it were, thrown out of paradise. Will she get back to Auntie Em? Okay. Now, and that's the plot question. What will she do? Will Dorothy do the right things in terms of action to get her back to where she wants to be? That's a plot question. That's, as it were, the arcing question of Wizard of Oz. In Toy Story, the same question is, will the toys move successfully? And that question overarches everything else that happens in the story. underneath that question is a character question for Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, which is, will Dorothy learn to care for other people more than she does for herself? And that's the transformation of the character.
Same question for Woody.
Absolutely. And when Dorothy realizes that she does that, then the fairy comes down and says, Dorothy, you had the, you were wearing the ruby slippers the whole time. All you ever had to do was tap your heels together. There's no place like home. But of course, Dorothy hasn't understood, as in a profound way, there's no place like home until that point, which is to say, she's come home to herself. When Dorothy comes home, she can go back to Kansas. Now, the important thing to understand is that the character question, will Dorothy understand that she needs to care for other people more than herself? When the answer to that is yes, that makes the plot question possible to be answered. And it's that connection that's deeply important. If Dorothy never understood...
in Children of Men, we'll talk about when you get... That's exactly...
If Dorothy never understood the character question and could never answer it, she would never go back to Kansas. If Woody didn't understand it, the character question in Toy Story is something like, will Woody understand? And again, it's understand, it's an internal journey. Will Woody understand that life is richer with Buzz than without? Once the answer to that is yes, he does understand that, then the question is, will the toys move successfully, is answered because together Woody and Buzz light the firework and get off and arrive home. So the plot question overarches the character question. The plot question is asked first in the story. It's set first. Dorothy has to go back to Auntie Em. The toys have to move successfully. Only once that question is up and running does the other question, the character question, unfold. And the character question is answered before the plot question is answered. And in fact, the answer to the character question makes the plot question answer possible. That way you connect plot and character.
Yeah.
That's the overarching shape of the story. In Diving Bell and the Butterfly, it's reversed. The character question comes first. Unlike Toy Story, unlike 90% of stories, the character question is: will Jean-Dominique Bauby find a way to make this existence palatable to himself? And that's not an action. There's nothing he can do. He's paralyzed. He's only got one eye.
Will he achieve satisfaction?
Will he find a way?
Yeah.
Will he be able to reconcile himself to this life? Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a character question. It's, well, will he, as it were, effect an internal transformation in himself to become able to exist in this way? And that question is asked first, and then the plot question comes after. Will Jean-Dominique Bauby write a book? Mm-hmm. And that question, will he write a book, is the question that finishes before the answer to the question, will he find a way of reconciling himself? And the answer is, will he write a book? Yes. And because he writes a book, he finds a way of making his life reconcilable to himself. Okay, so as it were, the character question is asked first, and the plot question makes the character question possible to answer. It's exactly the inverse of the other stories. It's exactly the inverse of Toy Story. It's exactly the inverse of The Wizard of Oz. Most stories have the plot question asked first, made possible by the answer of the character question. If you are doing it the other way around, it's a character-driven story. Which is to say, the character question comes first and is answered last.
But what makes those sequences? Because
for those who haven't seen it, writing a book is a big deal because he can blink. That's it.
Yeah.
That's his one eye. So it's basically his therapist reads out a series of letters and then he blinks when she has to stop or something like that. So yeah. Or in the English, as we'll probably play because we have a dub.
I'll recite this alphabet. I'll go one letter at a time and slowly. All you have to do is blink at the first letter of the word and then I'll write it. The whole process starts all over again and so on.
Hush.
We might just get some words and phrases. 2 more things for you.
What?
When the words is complete, indicate it with a double blink, like hitting the space key.
I'd love to.
And if there's an error, just keep on blinking your eyes. I know it seems terribly arduous, but it'll work, I'm sure of it. Your family, your friends will be able to use it too.
God.
Want to try, Mr. Bobby? Look at me.
All right.
Do you want to try this? Have you thought of something? That's great. So let's try.
Wait, no. I don't know what I want to say.
E? The first word begin with E?
No. Not.
Okay, first letter is not
No, it's not a E. I don't even know what to say.
I know how hard this is. I'll say them slow. E, S, A R G N T U L O M
Takes too long.
D B C
Can't keep my eyelid open
F
anymore.
B V
Hurry
H
up.
J I I. The word
You got it.
I is the complete word.
That's right. I begin with myself.
Now let's go on.
And so it is a huge thing. It's not like I'm just going to sit down and write I'm in a book and I got writer's block because, I'm a struggling screenwriter. It's like literally the process of writing a book is physically impossible. I think that's important because it is a reflection of his willingness to confront his locked-in situation.
And his determination.
His
absolutely.
determination.
E S A. Monsieur
This will
Bauby,
never
please
work.
look at
It's
me.
a nightmare. It will never work.
Should I go on?
I don't feel like it.
What I was going to say is, so what makes that sequence compelling then, if we've opened with a character sequence? Because it's not like a Johnny Boy level
Again,
of intensity. So
well,
where does the
I would
compulsion
disagree.
come from?
I would say if you watch the film, okay, and
I'm not saying it's not compelling. I'm just saying it's not.
Watch the film and look at the intensity of the way the film was working. Okay, the problem for the director here and the writer is there's no plot. Okay, there's nothing happening in terms of the audience going, okay, what happens next is not the issue. The audience is like, where am I? How do I understand this? What's going on? I don't get it. That's what the audience is thinking. And then, so what you have is an intensity of narrative, is that you are literally put inside the character's head. You're literally seeing the world as he sees it. When his vision blurs, the character blurs, the camera blurs. When he becomes unconscious, we fall into black. So how time is working, the intensity of the way that storytelling has worked. Yeah, his voiceover, we're hearing
We can
him think.
access him. We can access the character.
Putting this the other way, if we were external to him as we are from the first act
Yeah, the end,
onwards,
actually
I
halfway
think.
through the first act.
Yeah. So that sequence, I don't think, would be as compelling. It would be very difficult watching doctors trying to communicate to
what I'd say
to an inert being.
What I'd say to the audience listening to this podcast is go and watch Naked. Okay, and go and watch the character sequence, which is him in the security guard.
We'll put links up in
which has no, as it were, ostensible plot in it. It's just meandering around. Man, look at the intensity of the dialogue. Look at the intensity of the way the performances are. Then go to the beginning of Diving Bell, and look at how the intensity of the way the narrative works. Look at how subjective that perspective is. You hardly ever see a film as subjective as that. Look at how you are, visually thrown into a kind of storytelling that you don't normally get. Look at how hard this film is working to engage you because there's no plot.
Yeah.
Okay. Now that's the issue. If you have no plot, if you don't work that hard, like Naked works in one way and like Diving Bell works another, the audience will drift away. Because the thing that they're most used to being pulled into a story by is plot. So when you don't have plot, you have to work intensely hard, one way or another, stylistically, particularly in terms of dialogue. In Naked in particular, the dialogue is extraordinary.
Well, what about There Will Be Blood then, where there is no dialogue for the first, is it 19 minutes of the film or something extraordinary?
I want to finish off on the Diving Bell and the Butterfly because I think it's not just worth watching the film, I think it's worth reading the script. The script is incredibly well written. And even though the film was filmed in French, even though we have been playing English excerpts, the script was written in English. Because particularly the challenge is, it's easy to go, stylistically, the filmmakers had to work really hard to up the intensity and fill the vacuum as directors and composers and cinematographers. And absolutely, if you're a filmmaker, and I mean that broadly, it is absolutely a film that you should watch. But if you're a writer, read the script.
No, I mean, the thing about, to talk about, and just for a moment to walk off the main subject, Ronald Harwood wrote the script, Sir Ronald Harwood wrote the script. When you understand that the book he was given, because it's based on a book by Jean-Dominique Bauby, the person who's the subject of the film, when Jean-Dominique Bauby wrote the book, he had no idea he would die. Okay, and the fact is he died after he wrote the book. The film is an adaptation of a book written by a man who had no understanding of his own imminent death and had no knowledge of it. And so the book is not at all what the film is, because, in the film we see, the ultimate fate of the character. So he's given a book to adapt, which most of the most important action of the story is not contained within the book he's given to adapt. And certainly the meaning of the story, which is to say, if you look at the film overall is asking the question, how do you find meaning in existence? In the thematic sense, where is the meaning of life? Now that question was never asked by the book that he was given to adapt, because the writer of the book had no understanding that his life was limited. He didn't think he was going to die very quickly. So Harwood has brought an enormous amount. It's one of the most beautiful, complex, profound, and skillful adaptations. It's a different subject altogether, but that you will ever read. It's an amazing piece of screenwriting. It's profound and beautiful, and it kind of, if you read the original book, which in itself, John Dominic Bowlby's book, I'd recommend to read too, which is a lovely, beautiful, profound piece of work. And then you read the screenplay, and you read the two one after another, which I did. You just, it's like it's an embarrassment of riches. You have two wonderful pieces of work, one of which is inspired by the other. But you know, most of what this film understands life to be about, and the message of the life of the film, is not contained in the original. It's a relationship between the original, the screenwriter Ronald Harwood, and the original book. It's a profound piece of work. It's a great script. It's one of the very, very best adaptations I've ever come across.
And in just words on the page, and this will be the last I want to say it, but I'm gonna read some, because we've talked a lot about writing the experience, and you've talked about how that experience makes you ask those questions. I mean, it writes in blackness, silence, but you know, this on the page, writing in the experience, whether you as a reader ultimately think it's got the same intensity of what they produce on the screen, it doesn't. To me, it's irrelevant. A sudden flash, the faces of two nurses, one male, the other female, then just as suddenly, blackness again, the male voice, no. Jean-Dominique, open your eyes. Terrible French accent on my behalf. Like a flickering eyelid, a picture begins to take shape. A small, bare hospital room. The faces of the nurses either side of a bed, both looking down expectantly, directly into camera. In capitals, bold, the camera is Jean-Dominique Bowlby, known as Jean Du. As his eyes open, he sees the first foot of his bed, then curled, paralysed hands on the yellow sheets, the IV pole hanging over him, the two nurses smiling, leaning towards him. The female nurse pats his cheek.
Mr. Bowlby, keep your eyes open.
That is the experience. I'm having flashbacks to watching the film. Yeah. Like, it's not as like visually poetic, but the experience, those questions, what am I doing here? The grabs of imagery are all there on the page.
Now, the point I would make is if you had a plot at this point, you couldn't write that. It's only possible to have that intensive experience in that way because there's no plot to be worried about.
And the detail, like this is quite detailed, like to take your time with that description, and there it is earlier, like, yeah, like we've had this argument developing a script where it's like tighter. You want that on the page when you're writing an intense action sequence. It is like you read the Bourne scripts and it's like dash, like a fragment of a sentence, dash, fragment of another sentence. This is quite languid, for lack of a better word. Speaking of languid, now I think we can move on to...
Well, I don't want to spend too much time on There Will Be Blood. It's not even my favorite P.T. Anderson film, but...
Ladies and gentlemen, I've traveled over half our state to be here tonight. I couldn't get away sooner because my new well was coming in at Coyote Hills and I had to see about it. Ladies and gentlemen, if I say I'm an oil man, you will agree. I'm a family man. I run a family business. This is my son and my partner, H.W. Plainview.
It made me, when we were thinking about this, it very much opens with definitely micro plot questions, but because there's very little dialogue, you're very intensely put in the shoes of the character, the Daniel Day-Lewis character, because you're going, what would it take to be him? And you've got an idea of his character in terms of someone who's so committed to what he's doing that he's willing to put up with the isolation and the loneliness and the risks, because they establish stakes very early on with the death of his yeah.
Is his business bar is just one of his
I think it's someone he brings on to work with him.
Would you say at the beginning of the section you're talking about, would you say that it's clear to the audience what he's trying to do?
No. So there is like a tiny bit of a mystery. It's really hard, I think, to detach movies from their marketing.
But what happens then, therefore, when you don't know what's going on, what does the audience do? And I think the audience goes to a different place, which is, okay, I can't know what's going on because I'm not being shown it. So I'm going to ask a different question. Who is this man? What's his nature? How do I understand him? What drives him? And you drive the audience into character because you simply deprive them of plot.
But how long can you do that without giving an answer? Because it doesn't give an answer for the longest time. Like you barely hear a word. You realize that they're digging for oil eventually.
And a Johnny Greenwood song, a Greenwood soundtrack, adding just unbearable tension.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you can't take, you've got the benefit of a writer-director here, and you've got benefit of an amazing soundtrack, as you had in Drive, contributing to mood. But those are not enough, I think, for a screenwriter to rely upon in terms of creating compulsion. And look, maybe I'm asking the wrong question, because maybe a lot of people don't find it compelling. Maybe there are a lot of people who just switch off. I mean, the flip side of that is Cloud Atlas, which, because it was introducing like 6 different stories, it was so heavily plotted that in the end I had to give up. I had to just let go of trying to understand what the hell was going on and just sit back and let it sort of wash over me.
For me, it's like, Christopher Nolan movie with different levels of reality.
Inception.
Which is, you spend so much time working out how the plot works. You don't care about the people. I understand what's happening. I just don't care. I get it because it's like playing 3-dimensional chess. I've worked out the orientation of the story, so I understand the layers. But because I have to spend so much energy doing that, the people in the story I don't care about. I literally don't care because all my energy has been taken away. And I honestly think there's a law of there's only a certain amount of things an audience can care about. The audience has, as it were, a limited amount of engagement with the story, and you choose to whether you take up that engagement with plot or character. And if you, as it were, take it up entirely with plot, then you have to have an incredibly clever and beautifully plotted story. So you have a farce, for example, where the question of who are these people really is like, well, in a classic farce, it's a landlord, a lover, a thwarted wife, a fat bloke, whatever. They're types. And you don't go in a farce, if it's working properly, you don't go, I'm dissatisfied with the types. You just go, this is making me laugh. So, but the types have to be types because in order for the plotted action to be funny,
they don't have to think about.
You have to spend so much time doing it. Because you have to organize the plot so hard, because you have to have all sorts of coincidences. And if you look at Cage aux Folles, it's a great example. You organize the farce in such a way that you don't have, they're just types. And as long as it's funny, you don't care about the fact they're types, because it's all plot. And that's, as a demonstration of the kind of story that's all plot. You don't really care about the people. You understand them as exemplars of things. And there may be blood. Again, it's like, there will be blood. It's kind of like, I don't know. Do you have to worry much more about?
But what is it that keeps you watching?
I think
he spends so long like tapping at rocks and looking at them, and then sitting out and looking at the sunset.
Well, I think you're making an assumption that other people find it engaging.
Yeah, a lot of people didn't like it.
I mean,
and I'm one of those people that's kind of on the fence, where I'm glad I've watched it, but I don't rewatch it in the same way that I revisit other P.T. Anderson films.
I think it's an interesting contrast to other kind of really plot-heavy cold opens, which also raises a mystery. Like, these are the weird ones that come in my head, like Minority Report and Midnight Special, right? Drop you in the same thing, drop you in the middle of the action, don't explain what's going on, but they feel like plot, right? Even though part of what you're doing as an audience is like, Minority Report is about them, or the Matrix, right? We've talked about it in this rule of the world. It's the whole, we demonstrate the rules of the world in a cool sequence, and then we, after the first 5-10 minutes, explain what's going on. Midnight Special does that as well, right? What is it? Maybe There Will Be Blood is doing exactly the same thing. It is not telling you what the rules of this world is, right, and letting you explore it. It's just that it is decompressed in terms of.
I would say, what I would say about There Will Be Blood, what I think is compulsive about the opening is the intensity of the character Dan Day-Lewis plays. You have this guy who just looks to me like a kind of bomb's about to go off, and you're kind of waiting to see when will he explode.
I mean,
I think the connection to oil. There's that little moment where they do the sign of the cross on the baby with oil, right? Like they dip into it. It's like there is this like almost religious connection to oil. So the characters feel intense about their situation, so we feel intense.
I think one of the things that it does with that sequence by not actually revealing too much about his character other than it only reveals one aspect about his character, which is like his obsessive commitment to this thing, like the extent that he's prepared to give up to find this oil. Is that before you learn he's a monster, if you're on board with the movie after 19 minutes of dialogueless action about, finding oil and pumping it, then you are wanting to be on that character's journey before you find out how despicable a person he is.
I mean, Diving Bell and the Butterfly and A Simple Thing, he is actually not a kind, because he has an accident because of his affair, right? If I'm remembering Diving Bell and the Butterfly correctly.
It just kind of happens. It's more like
he
an
just,
act of
I mean,
God.
you,
He just
you know,
does.
I know you live in France, so it's like he's just French. But from what I remember, he just was kind of slightly, he's kind of a shitty, slightly
He was a shitty person, but
yes.
he's not punished by God. It's not like a God's judgment. Going back to There Will Be Blood, I mean, I would go back to this discussion we had earlier about Tarkovsky and stuff. You say, what compels you about There Will Be Blood? I would say is as much the kind of poetic, metaphorical, ideas of the way that story works. I mean, like I said, there's a limit. When you say, okay, I'm going to organize my story in terms of plot sequences, plot character sequences, and character sequences, there's another way of organizing a story, which is imagistic sequences, which is an entirely different way of thinking, which is I'm going to have an image logic. I'm going to have a character who is, as it were, striving in a wilderness, which brings connotations of Christ and connotations of sacrifice and all sorts of different resonances and pioneers and the birth of America and whatever. And now none of those things to do with plot or character or plot characters. It's actually imagistic sequencing. And then you have this intense, and I think what There Will Be Blood marries is the kind of character-driven intensity of Johnny Boy in Daniel Day-Lewis's performance, which again, you have the intensity of performance. So it's a character sequence married with, if you said, what is the beginning of that film? I'd say it's a character-stroke imagistic sequence. It kind of works in a different way. Thematic. It's not actually interested in plot or character logic. It's interested in a different kind of logic, which is here's a landscape, here's a character in a landscape, and here are the obsessions the character has. And kind of as long as you get that, that's kind of what you need to know in order for the story to work.
I could see it playing projected on loop in a gallery.
I hope I'm correct in this, but I remember listening to interviews with P.T. Anderson where his initial attempts were to make an entirely dialogueless film. And he only got, I think it's 19 minutes, however many minutes in before he had to kick in with character and plot questions in a more traditional sense before it became essentially an art installation.
Absolutely, and that's what it would be.
All right, should we try and wrap this up with Children of Men? Because you disagree with my
I thought
take.
you wanted to talk about Fargo, and for whatever
I do
reason,
want to talk about Fargo.
Given that scene sticks out like a sore thumb in the film, maybe we should talk about it now. So it sticks out. You're like, just get to fucking Children of Men, guys. And it's like, so let's just talk about the date scene in Fargo.
Jeez. Blood has been shed. We now want the entire 80,000.
I answered the darn... I'm cooperating here.
You had no call to get snippy with me. I'm just doing my job here.
What do you fellas got yourself mixed up in?
Police!
So, is there anything else you can tell me about him?
He wasn't circumcised.
Oh, yeah?
But I picked this scene because when we were talking about it, it was the idea of there are films that are following a fairly conventional, and not in a negative way, but following the conventions of the storytelling rules that they've decided to follow.
So do you want to do a little brief summary of Fargo?
Sure.
It's your pick.
It's
we're talking the movie now, not the TV series. You've done the TV series.
The original 95 movie written by the Coen brothers. But back then it was only directed by one of them and produced by the other one.
No, that's only because of DGA rules, not to do with how they actually just
and
to be clear.
it's essentially structurally it's a fascinating film because it starts out being about a film of a man who's trying to arrange for the kidnapping of his wife so he can get the insurance money to make an investment. It also then follows the hard luck story of these two criminals who are thrown together who take on this job. And then it finally, I think the protagonist of the story arguably is only introduced almost at the first act turning point, which is the cop investigating the disappearance and subsequent accidental murder the murder of this guy's wife.
And I mean, I think her being introduced late is fairly common in this kind of crime noir. The detective appears later.
But a lot of the
right?
crime noir films, it starts with the detective discovering the uncovering of the crime. You don't see the unfurling of the crime.
It depends on pace. Like Zodiac opens with the crime before we meet the detectives.
Yes, Zodiac being a true life story that is almost 3 hours long, that is quite apart from the crime genre.
But, you know,
looking
Fargo-
at David Fincher in Seven, it starts with the two detectives finding the body.
Typically, the genre begins with a crime and then the investigation.
And it's usually told from the protagonist's point of view. Like
we took a
you
break.
agree with Stephen, not with me, you bastard.
No, but you're right. You're right. No, you're right.
He's pointing at me.
But he said the crime first, then the detective. Probably not as late as the first act. But
Anyway.
this is all
Okay.
because but that's plot. That's interesting. That means that he's opening with plot. And I think the Coen brothers, broadly speaking, from what I've watched, are actually very plot writers. They're amazing writers that execute kind of plot character sequences very well in some incredible plot sequences.
Yeah.
Right? But there are moments, such as you will get to, where they actually explore character.
Well, I
good
think
character.
they've got really great handle on characterization throughout plotted sequences. And I think that's because they deal with quite eccentric
And they're fascinated by
heightened
dialogue and the
characters.
way that people speak. And I think that's a reflection of the minutiae of
And that's
character.
why they set Fargo in Minnesota, where they've got this, I think I've heard enough argues for and against whether it is actually a real accent or if they've completely made it up, but they've, based it on some reality. But the scene happens. So the cop, who's played by Frances McDormand, is heavily pregnant, married, is the local detective, is following this crime as it's unfolding, and then at some point she's been asked by an old high school acquaintance to meet up for dinner because she happens to be gone to Brainerd. I don't know. She's gone to a different town, and then you see Minneapolis. Yeah, that's right. She goes to Minneapolis. And she, and the scene is just her meeting this high school friend.
Mike?
Marge? Jeez. Oh, you look great.
Yeah, so do you. Oh, easy there, easy there, easy there, easy there. You do too. I'm expecting you.
I see that. That's great.
And it is completely unhitched from the plot in every single way. It has no impact on the crime, and it is a completely self-contained scene in that you could pick that scene out of the movie. And I'm not saying the movie wouldn't be better or worse, but from a plot perspective, you would not have noticed at all.
Except in the following scene, what happens is, because what happens in the scene is that this guy says, she says, how have you been? And he's a little bit kind of pushy with her as if he's like trying to get some relationship going, and she's pregnant and married, and she kind of puts him in his place a little bit.
Awkward moment, he's like, can I sit next to you? And he puts her
She
arm
goes,
around her.
she kind of goes, no, sit over there. And
I was married. I was married to... You mind if I sit over here? I was married to Linda Cooksey.
No, why don't you sit over there? I prefer that.
Huh? Sorry.
Oh, no, just so I can see you. Don't have to turn my neck.
Oh, sure. I understand.
and whatever. And then he tells about his wife, and he says, my wife died.
It's not that things didn't work out. It's Linda had leukemia. She passed away.
No.
It was tough.
There you go.
It was long. She fought real hard, Marge.
They have this kind of conversation, and it's a little bit awkward. But actually, the next scene, she's on the phone to her friend or sister or whatever, and she finds out that he's lied to her, that his wife has not died, that woman that he says was his wife that he married from school, he never married, and that he kind of hung around for a while, and she eventually got some kind of, order to get him to go away from her, and that he's a kind of weird, pesty kind of character. And so everything that in that scene that has happened was not true. Everything that he told her was a lie. And she kind of goes, yeah, but then she goes, well, you never quite know what people are like. But there's no consequence of it. It doesn't mean anything.
It's not from a plot perspective. I think those are all very influential on her character determination, because she's all like, the whole film is an exploration of, I guess, what are slightly ordinary people capable of
so
under the right conditions. and it's almost a naturalist. You know, you could imagine this being a Zola novella
But what does the
something.
scene serve then?
Exactly.
I think there's two things. On a micro level, I think there is kind of a little bit of a plot ticking along, which is we know it's a date, which means that he is an objective. It's like the Bourne thing, he is imposing on her. She, I think, is there, feels unconnect for the motivation because I don't think she's there to even talk to him about the crime, right? She doesn't want to talk about it when he pushes her.
What brings you down? Are you down here on that homicide, if you're allowed to, to discuss that?
Oh, yeah, but there's not a heck of a lot to discuss.
She's just there to have dinner with an old high school friend.
Yeah, she's a nice
right.
person.
So she has no objective, but he has an objective that he is imposing on her.
And they establish very early on, like he hugs her and establishes very clearly that she's pregnant, that he realizes that she's pregnant. And then he even says, "Oh, so you married, son of a Gunderson, So it's made very clear that even though that's his objective, he is aware that she is unavailable. As
No. That's why he does a tactic shift, right? He
Okay.
actually does a tactic shift, which is the midpoint of the film, the scene when he talks about his wife dying of leukemia. So he plays on her sympathy. So he's hoping to get basically a pity fuck, right?
Oh, and then I saw you on the TV, and I remembered, I always liked you.
Well, I always liked you.
I always liked you so much. You were such a super lady. And then I've been so lonely.
Yeah, I know, but I'm talking about the stakes of the scene in that he doesn't come into this scene thinking that she's still single or anything like that. It's not like.
But I mean, in terms of the story overall, say why is this scene in the story overall? Is it not? I mean, the truth about what we understand from the overall story is that Marge doesn't solve the crime through detecting. I mean, that's a really interesting character because she's a female character. Fargo, she gets to where she wants to get to at the end. You see, if you ask the question, why does Marge get there? It's because she understands people. And in many ways, she just allows them the space to be who they are. And most of her conversations with people, she doesn't say, she's not a male detective who says, I know where you were, I know you did this, I did that, I did that. She's not a plot-driven character. Because I did these things, she basically goes, I'm going to allow you the space to describe to me who you really are. And as they do that, all the things they've done become apparent. If you like, in that scene, what you see is, she goes, basically she allows the man space. And he reveals he's a creep. He reveals that he's interested in sex without very much else. He reveals that he's shallow, and then she finds out the next scene that he's a liar. So basically, everything that she needs to know about this case, the case of the date, she finds out. And she does virtually nothing. In terms of action, she doesn't drive the story. She just keeps conversation going. She's nice to him. She's sympathetic.
She's very good when she gets him to sit back
when she
over
needs
the other
to be,
side
absolutely.
of the table.
She diffuses that situation beautifully.
And it's very authoritative. She you get over there. And it's like she drives the story she's very, as it were, driving the action for that second. But basically the scene shows the nature of the character, which is that, again, it's a character scene. And this is who she is. This is a woman who is intuitively, and it's not just intuitively, because that makes it sound like it's not a conscious thing, whose strategy is that she understands enough about the world to let people be themselves. And if they're bad people, the fact that they were bad will be revealed. She doesn't have to force them into revealing themselves. And in fact, if she forces them, they may lie. If she lets this guy, Mike, whatever his name is, if she just lets him talk, he will reveal all his flaws and all his insecurities and everything. And she does. She basically says nothing. And as he jabbers away, the audience watches and goes, this guy's a fuck up. He's a mess. He's an idiot. He's incoherent. He doesn't understand. And she's amazingly controlled. And that's the way the story works. Why does she solve the case? Because she doesn't get that bothered,
And I think on a plot level, potentially, I'm not saying this is exactly how I remember, but I think it's her going, he lied over, her realization that he lied about something so profound made her kind of question other facts that she was given at face value. So I think from a character journey moment, it's the kind of scene that you add, which is, I need my character to go from A to C, and then I can create this moment, this character moment that makes them come to an understanding, which is maybe one that they reveal things to her and that bad people reveal to her, but also that people are capable, that seemingly normal people are capable of lying, lying about A, being married, and B,
so, you know,
it's like quite
as regards the
extreme.
scene, you then say, what's the question that drives the scene? And you say, well, you know,
how is Marge going to handle Mike? I think
it's like, will
established
Marge,
quite early on.
But, you know, is that what really drives the scene? Will Marge?
Because his intentions are made clear quite early on, and her intentions to not engage that are established quite early on. So the conflict is there.
But at what point in the scene, if you say, okay, let's say it's a plot question, will Marge be seduced by Mike, or will Marge rebuff Mike, or whatever? That question is answered at the moment she says, go and sit over there. At that point, it's clear in the scene, and we're only a third of the way through the scene, there's no way he's going to get what he wants. So in terms of the
But he
plot
keeps
question,
escalating his
he
tactics.
yeah, he does. But, you know, if you say to the audience, okay, stop the movie, do you think there's a likelihood that he's going to get to sleep with her tonight? The audience goes, no way is he ever going to. So in terms of the plot question, the plot question is not live.
Yeah, and that's why we're looking at this scene, because I feel like it is just a pure character
question.
scene.
The character question is, then say, okay, will she understand, or will Marge understand that she shouldn't take what people say on face value?
That's not what
I
the
don't
audience member is asking at the
what
time.
The yeah.
But I think it does. I think Stu's right in that by that following sequence where she learns about him, because there's two things about her. Yes, her strategy in life is to let people talk, and she's very non-judgmental. And I think part of that, you know, early on, she seems to have an attitude that is supposed to be almost like the Americana ideal of the region that she's in, of seeing the best in people. And she no longer, by the end of the movie, sees the best in people. I think, you know, even when she's driving,
there's a lovely scene at the end where she's
character, I don't understand.
Yeah, why can't you people just be nice?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a scene at the very end, isn't there?
Yeah, exactly. After he's just tried to mince his friend up in the ship, that she realized, and you know, it was that realization that allowed her to solve the crime to an extent, or at least be the victor of this journey.
But if you had to take that scene though and say, what question could you say that articulates the fundamentals of the scene? You know, would it not be something like, I mean, in terms of thematics, you'd say, will Marge's essential goodness overcome, you know, whatever it was, Harry's creepiness? You know?
Which is actually the plot question of the TV series, is at what point does decency win?
Yeah. And I think that's a good question for that, you know, for that scene. Thematically, we said in terms of character, will Marge understand that he is not to be trusted? The answer is no. She understands the next scene, but not within the scene.
After having spoken for 2.5 hours straight, we're going to try and wrap this up with Children of Men.
Should I mention we're 2.5 bottles of wine into it as well? Maybe that's why we're so loquacious.
The world was stunned today by the death of Diego Ricardo, the youngest person on the planet. The youngest person on Earth was 18 years, 4 months, 20 days, 16 hours, and 8 minutes old.
The ultimate mystery. Why are women infertile? Some say it's genetic experiments, pollution. Why do you think we can't make babies anymore?
Doesn't matter. It's all over in 50 years. It's too late.
Move along! Move along!
Hello, Theo. How have you been? I'm sorry about the theatrics. Police have been a pain lately.
I haven't seen you for nearly 20 years.
I need your help. Not for me, a girl. I need to get her to the coast, past security checkpoints. It's hard for me to look at you. He had your eyes.
So why did you come to me?
I trust you.
Show him.
Now you know what's at stake.
We have to meet the boat.
What is this boat?
The Human Project have sent a boat.
The Human Project?
Yes, the greatest minds in the world working for a new society.
We're almost there, Kate. We're almost there.
And I think Stu foreshadowed that he disagreed with me in this. But so Children of Men feels like a very plotted, traditional, in that sense, high octane
I don't
narrative
disagree
thriller.
with any of that.
Okay. But I'm just saying the way that it's experienced or felt, but there is a sequence in there, and it's probably more of a scene than a sequence, but where it does, the plot just stops entirely.
I don't think it stops.
Okay.
And this is where I disagree with.
Okay.
Right. So I think
should we introduce both the film and where
Yeah, so we
it's
should
at?
play the trailer, playing the trailer, blah, blah,
Mhm.
blah, right? And so this is filmed and set in 2027, so not that far now, in kind of fascist England. No one can have kids anymore, blah, 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 blah. Science fiction stuff, dystopia, fascism, blah, 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 blah. Theo, our character, when we first introduced to him, and this is important overall because it's actually a character question that opens the film. And on the page specifically, he is described as someone who gave up on the world before he is helpless, and you can remember.
He's a veteran of hopelessness. He gave up before the world did.
Right.
That's his intro in the big print.
And you don't necessarily feel that. Well, they dramatize it in the film.
The very first scene is everyone staring up at the TV, mourning at the death of baby Diego. He doesn't even look at the screen. He barges through everyone, gets his coffee, turns around and walks out of the coffee shop.
And there's a terrorist bombing behind
in that coffee shop.
In that coffee shop behind him, right? That's very important because I think that character question about Theo ultimately drives the film. And there's a series, I originally thought, I may be overprepared, that we're going to go and look at this film in terms of, hey, look at how it breaks down all of its sequences. But I think for this exercise now, what we've all have talked about, it's actually kind of pointless.
But the opening sequence is interesting.
The opening sequence is interesting because then he goes and visits his friend, Michael Caine.
Because there's no plot questions per se.
Nothing.
Especially because he is a veteran of hopelessness. He doesn't want anything.
He is literally not driving any dryly says to his boss, I'm more affected by the death of baby Diego.
So what is the character? If there's no plot question, can you articulate a character question for the opening?
I think ultimately it's about exploring what has happened in this world.
Yeah.
Right. That has led people to be so hopeless. So it is like the There Will Be Blood, and it's a slower version of The Minority Report is, to me, the science fiction cold open, which is what has happened to make people change.
You wouldn't say that it's something question like, what's his name, the character? Will Theo find a reason to live?
That's imposed on him, and he tries to reject it.
And it's not overly in the first sequence. The first sequence, I think it's one of the best expositionary sequences. We actually studied it, I think, in either character intros or world building. But basically, every single frame of that film is giving you new information. Walking out before the bomb goes off in the street, there's Indian tuk-tuks. So obviously there's been some downgrade in technology, and then there's, the bomb goes off.
Or just a kind of more of a Blade Runner-ing of the universe.
Yeah, and then as he's going on he leaves his office, he's on the train, and there's all these billboards about fertility testing is mandatory. There's refugees locked up at the train station, at the domestic train station. So
But does he care about that?
No, he doesn't.
So it's not the character question that's being, as it were, implicitly asked throughout this. It's
certainly being presented.
Will he find a way, or will this character engage with the world?
Or will the world find a way? I think this is interesting because I think, as I've been thinking about a lot, about with I'm going to use not just science fiction, speculative fiction is often about the world as a character. And I think Children of Men, the world is a character, and then it personifies it in Theo.
Yeah, I think that's
right. And because Game of Thrones is about the world, and it's about the world questions of that show and the thematic implications of that, right? And we'll get to your saying, because I'm just trying to skip over it, because this is interesting, because then it's a character thing. We explore him, and ultimately the plot is imposed on him, which is that he is kidnapped by what are called the Fishers, which are basically domestic terrorists.
Who are led by his ex-wife.
Yeah, right, which we don't know until that point. We know he has an ex-wife because when he visits Jasper earlier, so he goes and smokes blunts. This is opens with a terrorist bombing, and this character is so indifferent. He goes to work, whinges about him feeling affected in a dry glow Clive Owen way and goes and smokes blunt with Michael Caine.
But it's so much exposition. So like there's billboards on the train, there's these refugees at the train station. When he goes to Michael Caine, while they're smoking blunts and listening to, I think they go from like Bob Dylan to then like death metal or something. But he tells a joke about the Human Project, which is like the sort of saviors of this world.
Oh, sorry, go on.
No, I'm not telling it now.
No, come on, Jack.
No, fuck it.
No,
No,
sorry.
I'm not fucking done.
Go on.
Okay. The Human Project gives this great big dinner for all the scientists and sages in the world. They're tossing around theories about the ultimate mystery. Why are women infertile? Why can't we make babies anymore? Some of them say it's genetic experiments, gamma rays, pollution, same old, same old. Anyway, in the corner, this Englishman's sitting. He hasn't said a word. He's just tucking into his dinner. So they decide to ask him. They say, well, why do you think we can't make babies anymore? And he looks up at them, and he's chewing on this great big wing. And he says, I haven't the faintest idea, he said. But this stalk is quite tasty, isn't it? Eating fucking stalk. Eating the stalk. Italia.
So it's full-on exposition. And the only way that bit of expository dialogue gets away with it is because it's Michael Caine who's
telling a joke about the nature of this world, right? So it's character building who Theo is and his hopelessness, and the world building. And then the plot's imposed to him, the Fishers kidnap him.
Get your fucking head down! Okay. Get it! Step! Minimum! Step! Minimum! Who's fucking next? Go, 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 go!
You are under the jurisdiction of the Fishers. The Fishers are at war with the British government until they recognise equal rights for every immigrant in Britain.
We're not going to hurt you, we just want to talk. But don't do anything stupid.
Uncover him.
It isn't safe.
Do it.
Hello, Theo. It's me, Theo. It's Julian.
Then we meet his ex-wife, which we knew, and they've also planted with photos the picture of him, Julianne Moore, and a child. Yeah. So that's something that will build in his context, right? So this is all set up. And then basically they ask him to help them out.
Why am I here, Jules?
I need your help. I need transit papers. Not for me. A girl. She's a Fuji. Need to get her to the coast, past security checkpoints.
I haven't seen you for nearly 20 years, and you come asking me for transit papers.
Can you do it?
I don't see how.
You could ask your cousin. The government finances his Arc of the Arts. He has access to papers.
Yeah, but he'd never do it.
He would if you asked him.
I can't. It's too dangerous.
I can get you £5,000. I know you need the money.
What are you talking about? I don't fucking need your money.
Right. Sorry. My mistake.
And then he goes and visits his cousin.
But the plot question, you know, that he
It's
gets
so
kidnapped,
soft.
right? So suddenly it introduces, oh, the plot has started,
Stakes.
you know, something exciting. And he's like in a very small room with 3 different terrorists, bright lights on him, and it's all taped up with paper. And then he realizes that it's his wife. So then there's like a sort of relaxing. And then she's like, let's get out of here. She opens up the door and they all walk out of the room. And it just, again, all the stakes and sort of plot questions to an extent are let go. So it's a lot of this film, even though it feels like a thriller for a lot of, but so many of the scenes and so many of the sequences are at least plot character sequences where there is an overarching plot question, but a lot of it is character questions coming to the top of it.
And, well, you know, we've talked recently about worldview and the important characters espousing worldview. There is a world with a particular situation and the characters have opinions. Jasper's amongst them. Theo's adopted hopelessness. But Julianne Moore's character tells that story about tinnitus, right?
But the reason it feels different is because generically this kind of a story would have a much more plotted structure. And
When
so
it begins.
so you'd normally have a much more plotted kind of driving.
Which gives them almost permission to do it, right? And then you're right. And then if we fast forward, he accepts the mission from the Fishers. He goes and gets papers from his cousin. And then again is a world-building character revelation sequence. sequence. It's not like he just goes and has dinner with his cousin, and his cousin's like, "Yeah, all right, I'll help you." Right?
And a
There's
lot of
nothing
that cousin
hard.
scene is about world building. Like it's because the scene is essentially, can I have the transit papers? Yes, okay. Right? Plot question resolved. But there's
What do you
this
need?
weird.
No, it's actually, what do you need them for? I've got a girlfriend. That's good for you. Here, like there's the most minute amount of opposition.
But there's this. They're collecting. It's called the Ark Project. So they're collecting artwork
From around the world.
From
so
around the world to
Statue of
protect it.
David, the original Statue of David is now in like the Tate Modern.
And so that, and he asked the question like,
100 years from now, there won't be one sad fuck to look at any of this. What keeps you going?
You know what it is, Theo? I just don't think about it.
and so it's all world.
Yeah.
And
all character. It's
theme.
all- yeah, yeah.
It is character. The character of his cousin doesn't matter. He's just in that scene.
But what it is, though, if you think about it in terms of how his sequences work, if they're plot character sequences as opposed to what we'd normally expect is a plotted sequence. Okay, there's a, I don't know, in this story there is a savior, there's a Jesus character, there's a baby. It's Mary and Jesus, which is quite deliberately invoked towards the end. Okay, so basically this is a story about there is a world without hope. If you look at it religiously, okay,
And a character
and
without
suddenly there
hope.
is a Messiah that is born, which is say the baby, and the world which is lost is now has the potential to be saved, and this guy has the potential to save the world, and that's what the story is. Okay, so it's really about the nature of people and the nature of hope and the nature of redemption, and these are all to do with character. They're not to do with what. It's not so much about these issues are as a character issues. So you take a story that is normally driven by plot. And we have plot character sequences, and that's kind of what this film is. It's much more
But I think
plot character.
I
and
do
it
think
just
that
makes you
Stu-
think about the nature of the people in the story,
Yes.
rather more than the action that's happening. So when he goes and gets her, the baby and the mother, and
quite-
she's in this big action sequence, and there's people shooting and being killed all the time, and he's going through this building to find her. And he finds her, and then he brings her out, and then suddenly all the soldiers stop shooting, and they all start going on their
messianic
knees,
moment.
and all that kind of stuff. It's
That
all
is
like,
the climax of the film.
yeah, you kind of say, okay, well, what that's really about is character. It's not a climax that is fundamentally to do with action.
I'm going to
It's-
disagree with you to an
it's,
extent in
it's
that
really about-
I would go just here and say it's about the world. Because that climactic moment, there's all these people trying to kill each other out of hope and despair, and they hear the cry of a baby. And everyone, characters you've never met before, but all you know about them is that they're trying to kill each other.
But
and
some
they
characters
all
you have
stop.
met.
And some of them you have. But the fact that this, is hundreds of people that they're walking through, and they all stop, and they all look, and they all have different reactions. Some kneel and cross themselves, others smile, others it's about the world. But I do think you're right in terms of the world in this film is a character that is often dramatized through Theo.
I think, but again, you guys seem to. I'm interested. I haven't listened to your podcast on world, but you seem interested in of giving this notion of world as a character.
Not in all
But
films. I just think in this film.
but isn't it just simpler? That really, it's not. This film is not really about what happens. It's about the effect upon, for example, in this sequence, it's the effect upon these people of recognizing that a different person than they had thought was possible, i.e. they thought all children were dead, and now there is a live child. And it's really the effect on, so basically when they're confronted with a live child, what happens is those characters show their real natures.
Move back! Fucking move back! Stop! Cease fire! Cease firing!
They stop, they give up the role of a soldier, which is an action role. I am a soldier, I do these things. I am a rebel, I do these things. And they go, no. They, as it were, strip off their active personas and they become who they are, which is, oh my God, here is me looking at that child. And they become their true natures. And it's a story about character.
Every single person has that moment.
Yeah.
So it's not about
the background.
Because the whole sequence is about the nature of character.
Yeah, but it's
about
not.
the nature
But
of
the
action.
character's not individuated in any way. They all have the same reaction. So that's why I'm saying it's about the world. Because it's not about the individual characters. If it was about characters, then they would all react differently.
Stephen just did a face
because
of like, French.
a bit of meh, yeah, kind of. No, because if you thought, I mean, it's like saying, for example, when Jesus is born at the in the nativity, all the shepherds have the same expression. Well, yeah, it's the Messiah.
Yeah, but
You know,
Pontius
it's like-
Pilate,
it's
if
like-
he was at the thing, he would have a different
No,
reaction.
because if Pontius, there were three. I mean, let's not get too involved with this particular discussion, but there were three kings from the east, and they're all like going. If you were, at the side of the manger, and the Messiah was there, and the shaft of light came down from the stars, and it became completely apparent this was the Son of God. In that situation, there is no individuated reaction. It's like the general reaction is awe. Well, that's kind of what you get in Children of God is awe. Children of Men. It's just like a Messiah. He literally is. That child is, the chosen one. And everyone in that scene reacts in the way which is that he's the chosen one. But, when Hannibal Lecter appears in Silence of the Lambs and everyone looks at him and goes, ooh, that's Hannibal Lecter, they all have the same reaction, which is, here's that horrible monster.
No, but Jodie Foster doesn't react in that way. And that's what makes Jodie Foster different. That's what makes that moment
I
about
agree,
character.
that's true.
That's what I think. If you've got a moment where people who you have no idea about, you've never met before, they all have the same reaction, you can't say that that is about character. That has to be about the society. That has to be about...
No, it is about character. It's about... the scene is about how those people react. It's not about what they do. It's about who they are. And that makes it a character scene.
Okay.
Right, but that's at that moment because I want to roll back because I think this without going into the specifics, Pacific. Right, the point where we were trying to say there's a lot of plot character sequences earlier. There is an action sequence where Julianne Moore, which they're driving the car, they're intercepted. Incredible action sequence. Julianne Moore characters dies,
and I just want to point out just before that sequence, they make you fall in love with Julianne Moore in one moment where her and Theo are shooting ping pong balls from each other's mouths, and it's one of the most perfect.
Oh, fuck off. You gotta be kidding.
You know how many people I've tried this
don't
with?
wanna know.
You'll be happy to know, out of the hundreds,
Hundreds?
you are still the
I'm
only
not doing it.
one. Yes, you are.
No, I'm not.
Yes, you
The
are.
car's moving
yes,
too
you
much.
Are. Mm-hmm. You are. Right? Hilarious. No, wait. Okay.
Do it again.
Because again, the plot has
stopped.
Kind of stopped. They're just driving.
They're exploring a moment. We know the plot is for them to go to a safe house with Key, who we've met.
I think it's really simple. The film is, you take, as it were, a science fiction dystopic future thing. Sorry. But all you're doing is saying, okay, what happens if we tell this story more in relation to character than plot?
And that is what sets character of men apart.
And that makes it
character
different.
of men.
Children of men.
Children of men. No, that's exactly what it is.
Too many wines.
Because I'm going to come back to your scene, right? Because I want to point out is that is the distinctive action sequence that we know about, right? And then they stop down, we deal with all the politics of the fishes, and then we have the incredible action sequence when Theo escapes with Key and the...
Miriam, the midwife.
Right? The midwife. And they leave, and that's a plot sequence. Will they escape in time, right? And they're even the first one is becomes an action sequence. It's a character road trip. This film is a road trip. The question once he's asked about these papers, ultimately the plot that set his motion is that the papers that his cousin gives him, and we told this through dialogue, requires Key to be accompanied by someone else. And Theo agrees to do it for money, right?
No, but he deliberately does it. You get that feeling. There's a moment in the pub with Luke.
Here's a photo of the girl and a name.
Oh, hang on. We got a problem. All I could get were joint transit papers, which means I would have to escort them now.
Will you?
For a couple more grand.
Julian thinks very highly of you.
Does she?
Yeah. Thanks again.
So it feels like he's arranged this for two reasons. Because then he has the scene with Julianne Moore in the train station where she's like, you're just doing this for the money, aren't you? And he's like, they kiss. And it's clear that he's doing it both for the money and
to win her affection. Right. But the large plot of The Fishers, and this is important, is that they want, or at least Julianne Moore's character's objective is to get Key to the Human Project, which we do not know. There is no certainty about whether they'll turn up at
whether the Human Project is even real or not, which is...
This is the people who are the scientists who are exploring
on the
fertility
ship
on the ship,
right?
Yeah.
And stuff happens, and then ultimately what happens, they have to go to this, I keep on saying Box Hill, but it's Bexhill. Box Hill's a suburb in Melbourne. Box Hill on the sea, Bexhill on the sea, Bexhill, which is a refugee camp, right? And the plot question that is driving this whole sequence, right, is one that they know they have a very specific, this is thriller action movie stuff. They have to be there at 6 p.m., blah, 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 with her to get picked up. And if they miss, they're fucked, right? We know the impending pressure that the Fishers are planning some kind of military operation. And Key basically goes into labor. So you've got that ticking clock, right? And then you have a series of plot-driven sequences at that point, right? This point, I would say Theo is largely committed to the mission.
Yeah,
right?
I think his character journey ended.
Almost, right? But it's because there's one last question for him, right? But it turns into plot stuff because then he is separated from Key. He has to go and find her. Then he delivers the baby. Then they get separated. Then they have to leave. He loses Key again. He goes and finds her. This is all the action stuff. What's really interesting about that reaction that you're talking about is the plot stopping. Literally, the plot is stopping for everyone. The objectives of the rebels to fight the army versus everyone all stops because of this baby. So it is a character moment because quite literally they're stopping achieving their objective. And then he goes and then they have to go and find the boat to put Key on there. We learn that he has been shot. And the end of the film, and this is a massive spoiler, is him sitting in this rowboat in the fog, and the Human Project has yet to turn up. But he is content. He has found hope, right? And then he basically dies, and then the boat turns up. And this is interesting because his character question, both the character question we were saying has been resolved. He has found purpose in life.
So what's the character question? Will he find a purpose in existence?
Will he find hope?
Hope. Yeah.
Okay.
Right, and I think that's why it stayed in the big print, and that's why I wanted to say, will he find hope? And he finds hope. And for hope to exist, he needs to, faith is another one. There is a big speech by Jasper about faith versus chance, right?
And that's the scene I actually want to talk about.
Really? I thought you wanted to talk about the scene in the hospital.
That is the scene I want to talk about.
All right,
because
put a pin in that.
Okay.
Point is, I'm just saying that the whole thing turns into an action movie, but then there's ultimately this question, and then will he find hope? And the way to find hope.
So the action question, as with the plot question,
it's like find the baby. Find
will
Key.
he get the baby to safety?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Will he
and
get
that drives the whole
and the baby, not to safety, to the Human Project.
To the Human Project.
Which
okay.
could be complete fantasy. Like there's this idea seeded
and that
throughout.
question is answered at the end, and the answer is yes.
But
It's
after
not
he's dead.
Okay,
it's
that's
not
okay.
fantasy, but it's after he's dead.
Okay.
And that's important. But there's a point when he's like, let's get the fuck out of here. And he's always questioned the Human Project.
Yeah.
Even when he's in Bexhill, he talks about, what do you mean it was mirrors?
What time are we supposed to meet the boat?
Sunset tomorrow.
How do we know that Luke and his mob haven't intercepted it?
Luke has no way of contacting the Human Project, nor does anyone else.
Say again?
Contact with the Human Project is done by mirrors. Julian was our mirror.
What do you mean, mirrors?
Mirrors. They contact one of our people. That person contacts someone else, and so on till word gets to Julian. She tells Luke.
You mean you never actually talked to any of them? Don't fucking tell me you never actually talked to
All
them.
right. Shh. Breathe it out.
Is she okay?
That's it. Breathe it out. Breathe it out.
Always an escape clause for him, saying
At the end of the film, he's on the boat with her before the Human Project has come up, and the baby is crying, and he says, "Put the baby up and pat the baby."
She's probably got wind. Put her on your shoulder. Just tap her back. Gently.
And it seems to me that having watched it, that is kind of the apotheosis of the character. That's the point where he understands something profound, which is that, and I don't know exactly how you would say what it is, but it's the sense that you have to keep the child alive, that you have to, that you have to keep going, you have to make the child comfortable. It's kind of like, it seems to me that's a
it
point
humanizes the child.
A kind of realization that he comes to just before his death.
Yeah,
but
and it's also related
Isn't
to
that
Key
right?
because Key wants to name the child. There's a running joke about names.
Yeah, and he calls it Dylan or something. Yeah.
Yeah. But in the end, she names it Dylan after
She wants to call it Froley and then Bazooka. And then she chooses
Bazooka,
Dylan, which was his son's name.
He's dead. And that's
His
what we
son who
find out.
died.
Like his wound in the past when his son died unexpectedly. But so coming
It
all that.
sounds an entirely conventional story then, in terms of structure.
Yes.
It is. I mean, look, some things that I find amazing about it is that it only has 3 action sequences in it. I mean, one of those action sequences is like 20, 25 minutes of
almost no cut.
unrelenting action. So it does that very well. But then all the other sequences, often the plot questions, they are plot character sequences where the plot question is just sort of there to allow these characters to hang out with each other. And so I think it's a really excellent sort of, they call it elevated genre these days, where they've taken genre and just made it good, essentially. But
No, I disagree.
Okay, but this is the buzzwords that I keep hearing. But there are two scenes in the film that happen quite late. And one is they've escaped from the fishes, and it's before they've figured out they even need to go to Bexhill. But they've reached the sanctity of Jasper's house. And Jasper says, "Don't worry, I know, I've got a plan." But then doesn't tell us what the plan is. And then they just have dinner. And that is the scene that you're talking about, where they're talking about fate versus chance. And it is essentially, faith, sorry. It is essentially a character exposition scene, because that is where Miriam and Jasper are talking, and you learn that why Theo is hopeless. He had a son.
But they were there because of what they believed in the first place, their faith. They wanted to change the world, and their faith kept them together. But by chance, Dylan was born.
This is him?
Yeah, that's it. He'd have been about your age, magical child. Beautiful. Their faith put in praxis.
Praxis? What happened?
Chance. He was a sweet little dream. He had little hands, little legs, little feet, little lungs. And in 2008, along came the flu pandemic. And then by chance, he was gone.
Oh, Jesus.
You see, Theo's faith lost out to chance. So, why bother if life's going to make its own choices?
And that's when he gave up on life, before the world gave up. And yes, it is there for expositionary purposes, but there is no plot question whatsoever.
It's a pure character scene.
It is,
And in fact, it plays it out, because the whole thing is actually Theo listening from around the corner in the
only reason
foreground.
it's startling, the way you find it startling, is the same reason that, Fargo is, the scene in Fargo is startling, which is generically these scenes, as it were, an investigation movie in Fargo, or a science fiction dystopic
Right,
story,
movie, yeah.
Is essentially that these scenes are always driven by plot. And then you get these directors and writers who come along and say, what if I don't do that?
Yeah.
What if I simply have a scene about character? And what happens is you get this extraordinary effect, which is, the reason it's extraordinary because you've seen a lot of other films where this never happens. And suddenly you get this scene where the writer goes, and this is what's really important about sequences, is that, is to understand that, what's remarkable about sequences is that you can play them how you like as a writer. You can go, and it's important, particularly if you're writing genre. You say, okay, how does genre normally work?
This is
how
where
does
I
the
hope we would
genre?
get.
How does the genre that I really like work? So if you like science fiction, for example, okay, science fiction broadly works in one way, but look at the science fiction movies you really like. Okay, and say, what do I like? And I incline to, each of us will have a different taste. And if you look at them, you'll go, well, I tend to incline to stuff that's very plot driven, or you tend to incline to stuff that's plot character driven, or you might incline to stuff like Solaris, which is kind of character with a little bit of plot driven. Like Tarkovsky I'm talking about. So, and you think, okay, well, that's what I like. So then you go, okay, well, it works the way I like. The reason it works the way I like is because it's structured this way. The sequences are organized this way. What if I take, for example, a much more mainstream subject and I treated it in the way that Tarkovsky organized the sequences in Solaris? Then would I get this sense of character and this open, expansive character, but really limited plot? Or what if I manipulated it a little? How do I play with it? The the reason that you need to understand how sequences work is because you need to be able to play. For a writer, it's not about, okay, it's not a formula. It's not, okay, well, if you write this kind of film, that's how they work. If you write this kind of film, that's how they work. You need to understand that you can read any film in terms of its chapters. So you watch a film 4 times and you get to know it, and then you watch it for chapters. You say, okay, I'm just going to watch the chapter. You go, oh, look, there's the end of a chapter. There's the end of a chapter. There's the end of a chapter. And then you go, okay, how did that chapter I just looked at work? What drove it? And you go, it's a plot-driven chapter. That's a character-driven chapter. That's a character-driven chapter. And then you get this sense of how these stories work. Yeah. And then and it's just, it's kind of like becoming familiar with the underlying grammar of narrative. And then as a writer, it's not even necessarily about making conscious decisions. It's if you want to tell a story a certain way, once you've, as it were, got an understanding of how different writers in different films have played the sequences in different ways, you will kind of write the way that you want it to be. And it's not about planning. And the thing I keep talking to people when they say, well, it sounds like you're saying, okay, here's a kind of formula. If you write this kind of movie, you write this way. If you write this kind of movie, it's nothing like that. It's like saying, it's like, if you learn the trumpet, okay, you've got a valve, you've got 3 valves, and you can play them certain ways, and you play and you do all this kind of practice in order to be perfect at doing it that way and that way and that way. And then you improvise. And then you follow, as it were, your impulse. You don't follow a piece of sheet music, but you have to know how those valves work before you can improvise. Yeah. And this is, for me, in terms of structuring a story, sequences, and, it's not just sequences in terms of, 10 minutes. It's also in terms of a scene. Yeah. How do I organize a scene? And if in the middle of that scene I want some character, how do I, so I say my scene is, as it were, a plot scene, but I want, in the middle of that scene, I want to have a section which is simply about character. Yep. So I have a plot scene that works for 6 minutes, but for 40 seconds in the middle of that, there's no plot. Yeah. I'm just going to drop some character in. And you can write scenes in the same way that you think about it. It works in the same way. And you have to become fluent in this. My thing about for writers is that you just have to know this. You have to play with it. You have to watch other stories and see how they work. You have to play with your own writing. You have to see what your own predilection is, because any writer will have a tendency to work in a certain way. Yeah. And so you go, this is how I tend to write. So if I'm trying to do something different, I need to work against my predilection. I need to know what I tend to do. Some writers tend to be character sequence writers. Some writers tend to be plot characters. Some writers tend to be action. And then you need to
write well.
You just need to work out, how do I tend to write, and what kind of genre am I writing, and what is the tendency within the genre? And for example, does my predilection marry with the overriding tendency of the genre, or is it completely opposed to it? Because then you might find that you're trying to write, I don't know, a detective story, but you tend to write character sequences. And then you can't understand why people say to you, it doesn't kind of hold up, because you're tending to write about the people in the story, and they're tending to look for the organization of the plotting. Yeah. And you need to say, okay, what if I write against my tendency? What if I write, and that's why you need to constantly explore this. It's not about, it's not inherent in the stories.
Because one of the things I want to take away from this, I mean, all our listeners will know that Stu and I are kind of attracted to quite narrative genre storytelling, but I think we're both attracted to the not straight genre, where it does take it to this additional level, like Bourne Identity.
Kinky genre is a more exciting term than elevated genre.
Okay. Kinky. But I think a lot of these sequences are often there for pacing purposes. Like, we need to take our foot off the gas before we put our foot back down again, right? And I'm totally happy with that. But the 2 questions that I've taken away just from tonight, not even preconceived, which is often how I approach this podcast, is what would sustain a sequence if you answered and resolved the plot question really early on? Like, just think about a scene where you're like, all right, I have to get to this plot point by the end of the scene. But what if I answered that here? Like right at the beginning of the scene, as they did with Fargo. As you said, right at the beginning of that scene that she's never going to sleep with him.
But that's what makes it.
That play out.
But that's what's a midpoint. That's what makes it a midpoint.
No, but it's not even a midpoint.
But it is. Right
at the beginning of that scene, you get the feeling that he wants to sleep with her.
But if the plotted objective of, okay, what does he want? He wants to sleep with her. What happens is immediately she says, it's never going to happen. It's not a plot scene.
And I get that. And that's
the scene is about character.
I'm not saying one way or another. I'm just saying that if you're exploring a scene, just as a writer, think about what happens if you took the plot question out, or if you answered the plot question right at the beginning, and then how would you played out? What would come out? What would you explore?
Again, it's really simple. You have to ask a simple question. Okay, at what point is the question of the scene articulated? And the question is, if it's a plot, if you have no plot question, it's a character question, and you have to say to yourself, and again, you have to be careful. This is not a recipe to write. It's a recipe to rewrite. Okay,
I think that's where Draft Zero kind of lives.
Draft Zero should really be called like Draft 22.
Yeah. You look at your scene and you say,
fail.
okay, there is no plot question to this scene because the plot question is disposed with early on. The question in that scene, in the Fargo scene, is really what does the character have to understand? And it's will Marge or will Mike understand whatever that is? And then that's what does the scene articulate? Will Mike understand that Marge is more interested in helping him become happier than she is in sleeping with him? For example, you might articulate it like that.
I think that's
and then you say, okay, that's the scene. And then the answer may well be no. Mike never understands that Marge, but the audience understands. Yeah. The audience understands that Mike has not understood that Marge is more interested in helping him than she is with sleeping with him.
Which almost makes him a comedic character because he fails to change.
But
right?
I think
And
that's
what makes him so
like a
pathetic.
lot of where the Coen Brothers comedy comes from is those straight characters who just aren't aware of oblivious of their own condition.
But the audience get, the point is these things about sequence questions and sequences and sequence scenes and scene questions, etc. It's always about the audience.
Yeah, definitely.
It's not about the writer. It's not about the characters. It's about what do the audience understand. Now, they may not articulate it. If you stop the film and ask the question, what does the character want at this moment, they can probably answer. And in fact, if you stop the film and say, what is the character trying to understand at this moment, they can probably answer. If it's not clear to them, it's not about what you think. It's really what's on the page for the audience.
Yeah.
And that's why I think sequences are important, because it forces the writer. When I talk to a writer about, okay, let's look at the organization of your story. I'm not saying let's look at what I understand or let's look at what you understand. I'm saying what is the audience understanding from what they see.
Yeah.
And the notion of sequences is if the sequence is not understood, if the question is not understood by the audience, it's still a question. The writer says, well, I understand it to be this. And I always go, when I'm talking to a writer, okay, where on the page does it say that? When do the audience get it? When, in this sequence, at what point precisely, and it's not, when I'm working with writers, it's not a vague thing. Literally, I can point to the precise moment on the page. Tell me when the audience understands the question. And it's not like somewhere on page 3. It's at this line, halfway down the line, at that word is when it's articulated. And if you can't be that precise, then you're not doing it properly.
And I think I want to, I think this is where I've been pushing back, at least on the character thing, is I think there is, may not be at a sequence level, maybe more at a scene level, but I do think there is a thematic scene. And this is where I was getting at, that it's a world view, like the Stargate sequence, I think in 2001 is very much about making a feeling, like you said, poetry. And there's another scene in Children of Men just before they get on the armored car into Bexhill. They're in a school.
This is the scene I thought you were going to talk about.
Okay, so they're in a school. It's an abandoned school because they haven't been children for 20 years, right? It's overgrown. There's a deer running through it. And Key, the mother, still pregnant, hasn't had a baby. She's sitting in a swing and they're looking at her through broken windows. And it's,
nothing subtle about it.
It's not, but it works within the film. They built the world such that doesn't feel as overt as it does when I'm saying it, right? And Miriam, the midwife, without any prompting from her character other than maybe people want to fill silence, starts telling Theo about what it was like being a midwife when suddenly his children stopped being born. And she talked about the world's descent into hopelessness.
As the sound of the playgrounds faded, the despair set in. Very odd what happens in a world without children's voices. I was there at the end.
Now you're going to be there at the beginning.
Yeah. I'll be there at the beginning. Thank you.
And it is all just thematic exposition, essentially. It is them taking a moment, breath, the plot has stopped because they're waiting. They're just literally waiting around for the plot to drive up into the driveway, which it does at the end of this scene. Yeah. And they're taking a breath, and they're not talking about who they are as people, what they want, where they need to go, what their objective is. They're not even talking about their internal needs. They're talking about the world. They're talking about what this movie is about.
Yeah.
But I think on a technical level, the scene has got two things going for it, right? Which is we are waiting for the impending arrival of Sid, so they've got to meet. They have to wait for Sid.
That's what Stephen was talking about earlier. So long as you've got all the plot questions arranged, the audience is happy to sit back and get taken off the hook, as it were, because they're confident you're going to pick them back up again.
Right. If Sid was out the front and like revving his Humvee and they're like having a thematic thing, there's that. But then also we just, and this is something that we haven't gone into a lot of detail from, the Key starts having contractions before she hops into the Humvee. So the question, or is it just, she knows. No, she knows.
She's in the Humvee.
But I think she hints towards before, right? Because the point is there's a very little gap, but I've got a feeling it's just before they're getting to that plot is resolved and the next plot has already started. So they overlap. So there's this transition and there's just this little bit of space. And what is interesting, I think, on a character level about Miriam is that it's this, we've talked about it before, this idea that you have dialogue to compel action from another person, which is Theo gives her an option to stay with the Fishers, right? And for reasons that are other than that she is a midwife, she chooses to go with them and keep Key safe rather than siding with the Fishers who want to keep Key with them.
She's not a deep character, but
I think ultimately, I just want to finish what I'm saying. I think she is telling Theo this because he wants to understand why she is prepared to sacrifice herself for this child, which ultimately she does when she stands up and protects Key in front of the guard on the armored car. So I think it's important. It's thematic and world, but it is not just thematic as in the theme of the film. It is the worldview of the character that both explains the character
it's an interesting question.
I
mean, what you're kind of saying in a broader sense, get away from the details of the story, is, okay, we're saying there are plot questions, there are plot character questions, there are character questions. Are there sequences or scenes that are driven by thematic questions that are not fundamentally to do with the character and what will happen to them, are not, and what happens to them in terms of action, who they are is in terms of character, and are there questions which are more to do with in scenes and in sequences which are to do with what is this film really about?
Yes.
So can you say that, for example, the opening sequence of There Will Be Men is really There Will Be Blood is fundamentally asking
There Will Be Men.
It's fundamentally asked the question, what is this film really about?
Yes.
We're going to lay out as well the thematic center of the story. I haven't thought about that very much, and I think it's a really interesting question. And I think the answer is probably yes. I think there's probably another question you could ask, which is, are there also, if in terms of asking what questions which drive sections of the story, are there also imagistic questions? Which is, for example, a question like, I'm trying to think, if you take, I'm sorry to talk about films that people may never have heard of, but Sergei Paranjarov, one of my favorite filmmakers, a Russian-Armenian filmmaker, made a beautiful film called The Color of Pomegranates. Extraordinary, beautiful piece of film. Would be absolutely one of my top 3 films of all time, which has absolutely no narrative to speak of. It's really a it's not entirely non-narrative piece. It's a film based on a series of poems written by a 12th century Armenian mystic monk. But essentially the logic of the story is imagistic, i.e. repeated images and colours and a kind of thematic resonance, and that you understand it's kind of about spirituality and the relationship of man and God, and it kind of is about the color red and circles, and that's kind of as much as you can probably say about the film. You have to see it. When you see it, you won't mind that. You'll just go, oh my God, this is extraordinary. But absolutely, you then say, is there a kind of thematic question or an imagistic question? Tarkovsky, I very often think you could ask, what coheres the sequence of the film together. I mean, really what we're asking when we're saying thematic questions or sequence or plot questions or plot character questions is what binds this section of the film together.
Yes, exactly. And what keeps the audience watching the film.
Now, some audiences don't like imagistic sections, so they will walk away from it, and that's fine. So if you want to make,
unless it's music videos,
absolutely it will be. So if you want to make
they're only 5 minutes long, generally.
if you want to make a feature film that is popular to audiences, you will tend towards plot and plot character sequences. If you want to make, as it were, a mainstream art house movie, then you will make plot, character, and character sequences. If you want to make a film that's right out there, you will make a character stroke imagistic stroke thematic sequences. But basically this is the palette in terms of structure that is available to the writer. And it really depends on it's really, the reason I think it's worth exploring is it's like saying to a painter, you may never think you want to paint in blue, but if you knew how blue worked, if you played with all the different kinds of blue there are, if you ever needed blue, you could use it. So if you don't like Tarkovsky, that's fine. You don't ever have to make a film like Tarkovsky. But if you knew how he did it, if you ever do, then you can do it. Or if you ever want to make a movie that looks like a kind of, a James Cameron movie, where you drop in the middle a Tarkovsky section.
You're blue.
What would happen? What would happen if you made Titanic, but you put in some non-typical sequences? And it's really about being fluent. It's kind of like a language of narrative. And for me, it's not, what I find fascinating about it, it's not so much, I'm not a writer, and so it's different from me, but it's not so much that, you think, I have to write my story in this way or that way. It's simply, this is the palette. This is the way that these are the tools you can use. And if you look at a film you don't like, look at Naked. Many people don't like Naked. I don't care if you don't like it. For most people who like it, they love it. And I'm one of them. Okay, and there are many people who love that film. Now, I don't care if you don't like it or not, but if you understand how it works, it's like saying, personally, I don't like Titian, but I understand how he uses color. I understand how he uses perspective. I understand how he draws figures. Okay, I don't like it, but I understand it. And if I ever wanted to do that, I could do it because I understand it. That's what I think is interesting about this stuff. Because amongst all this exploration, you'll find where your stories are. You'll find the way to express the story you want to tell. And it's kind of like, for me, it's like, when you go to art school, you draw nude figures. You may never paint a nude in your life, but because you know about perspective, because you know about proportion, because you know about color, you can do all these things. And for me, this notion of sequences is about organizing narrative.
Well, I think what makes Children of Men stand apart, having conducted this analysis, is that sequence by sequence questions. Like the fact that it decides in each of its sequences to make it at least, more character-driven questions in almost every single sequence. There's only 3 or 4 sequences in that whole film that are pure plot-driven, as opposed to Bourne, where all bar one are plot-driven.
Or to compare it to another Cuarón, Gravity. In terms of it developed on the same cinematic techniques of the cuts and stuff like that, but it's going to be Children of Men we revisit in 30, 50 years.
And I think a lot of people disliked Gravity because when it tried to drop in that character-driven sequence, it felt like it was... it just didn't feel...
the dream sequence. We're continuing to... We're studying more and more films.
But the thing I would say, the final thing I would say, I think, is that...
That sounds good.
The thing to understand is that this notion about sequences and understanding it, it's not about writing. It's not about how do I write the next script I want to write. It's more about understanding how writing works. And I would say it's really useful to look at films you like and to explore films you like and understand how the sequences work and where the sequences are. But if you sit around and say, okay, I'm going to write a new film or I'm going to write a new TV show, and I need to think about the first sequence and whether it needs to be a plot sequence or character sequence, you're entirely missing the point. You need to write what comes out of you. Okay, and you absolutely do not need to be analytic in this way. And I think if you start being analytic in the sense of, okay, analyze the page I'm thinking of writing or the next 4 pages that seem to be coming out of my imagination. If you start applying this analytic process to your writing process, then you will become, it's fatal. It's once you've written it, then just start thinking about it then. It's not a creative tool. And not to mistake, okay, it's not a recipe, this is how you need to think about the story. It's simply, once you have the story, look at how it falls into chapters and say, okay, what drives that chapter? Is it plot or character? Or is it a kind of blend? And what happens if I made it more plotted? What happens if I made it more characterful? How would it shift? And how much closer would it be to what I feel I want to be doing as a writer?
And I think we come back to this, and it's not just in this episode that we come back to it, but in a lot of our episodes, it's how do we want the audience to experience our story, because that's ultimately why we tell stories.
And
that is why we are a storytelling species, is to impact on whoever is the listener or
and we are our first audience for the story, our stories.
And
we
to me,
less write the stories than we are just the first audience for them.
And it's about efficiency of that. It's like, to me, often the people who I constantly go back to get feedback from are the ones who say, rather than this is what I think you should do with this story, is this is what I think you want to do with this story, and this is how I don't think you're getting there, right? And then I can go and think back and go, you know what, maybe this sequence isn't doing what I want it to do because I'm too character driven and not enough plot, or vice versa. Because I recently read, I'm going to sub-tweet a listener of the podcast who I read for. He's done a pilot for a TV show that he wants to essentially be the engine for the TV show is an anthology of short stories, each episode. And there is not enough, in the pilot that I read, there's not enough plot questions keeping me going. And I'm like, I was giving him all these suggestions about maybe make it one short story or what have you. But he had a very clear idea of what he wanted to do, but he knew what wasn't working. And it was this balance of, plot, character, and your character-driven sequences. It was about keeping the audience engaged while delivering what he wanted to deliver.
For me, and I thought this may be a point to end on, but you guys can disagree, which is, I'm going to use one of my terrible music metaphors. It's when I was like learning jazz and you're practicing your scales and your modes, and it's like, why do I have to do all this boring shit? It's like, and the teacher's like, so you can forget about it, so you can just play. Right, you need to know this stuff. You learn it and you build it into you so you can just play and you can express, and that you'll find that you're responding to what's in front of you.
It's absolutely, it becomes, the thing about it is that watch stories that you like and watch stories you don't like. It's easy when you don't like, and just go, how do these sequences work? Where are the sequences? Where are the end of the chapters? Where's the new chapter? What drives this chapter? How is it structured? How is it organized? Get used to reading it like that. And after a while, when you enjoy something, you'll stop doing that. You'll just enjoy it. And then you're writing, it's the same thing. When you're working hard, it'll become apparent. When you're flying as a writer, it just comes out in your process. It's exactly like, as you say, musical scales. I think it's a fundamental part of writing. I think it's something a writer has to understand, in the same way that, an artist has to understand perspective. If you can't understand perspective, you can never draw without perspective. It's like Picasso said, you have to forget what you know in order to do what you can. And if you don't know it to start with, you can never forget it. And this is what this is about. It's about understanding, how it organizes in order not to think about it. And it's a peculiar thing, but
to make it look effortless at the other end.
Yeah, it's kind of like, and quite often it's annoying with a lot of writers I talk to, because we're talking about in some analytic sense. Some writers I work with do this automatically. It's in them. And if you ask them to think about it, if I ask them to say, okay, well, how do the structures work? They find it quite difficult, and they get very, very discomforted about it, because it's something they do automatically. Most writers I work with don't do it automatically. They can learn it, but a lot of people, the best writers, they don't think about it. It's just an instinctive thing in them. But you have to, as it were, learn and understand this process of, what drives a section of story. Is it a character question? Is it a plot question? Is it a plot character question? How does it work? Once you understand that, and it becomes an automatic process that you ask yourself, eventually you'll forget that you're asking it. And then you'll kind of write from the soul of yourself, which is, I think, the best place to be. But it takes, just like all these artists spend 20 years drawing from life in order to forget what that looks like. It's the same thing.
Yeah, just watch the journey of Kandinsky.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Picasso.
All this starting realism and you end up somewhere else.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, should we actually end this thing?
I think that was it. I think that was it.
We've talked for an inordinately long time.
You like spy movies, Mr. DeVere?
Nowadays, they're all a little serious for my taste. The old ones. Marvelous. Give me a far-fetched theatrical plot any day.
The old Bond movies. Oh, man. Oh, when I was a kid, that was my dream job. Gentleman spy.
I always felt the old Bond films were only as good as the villain. As a child, I rather fancied a future as a colorful megalomaniac.
What a shame we both had to grow up.
I hope you all feel like arguing with either Stu or myself
about anything on this episode or anything in general.
And you can find many ways of getting in touch with us at our website at draft-zero.com.
At the website, you'll also find the show notes for this and all our other episodes,
as well as links to support us and spread the word for free via a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.
Very important for spreading the word.
Or if you think that what we do here is worth $1 or preferably more than $1, then you can also find links to our Patreon page to support us getting these episodes to you quicker. Thanks.
And thanks for listening.